Welcome back to Chronos History Hub, Traveler. Tonight, we journey north, where the wind carries whispers older than kings, and mountains sleep beneath veils of mist. Here, between the sea and the heathered highlands, a nation was not born in conquest, but in endurance. Stone by stone, name by name, Scotland rose. A land of clans and castles, of faith and firelight, where history walks softly and memory never dies. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, from where in the world are you watching this journey unfold? What ancient dreams stirred within these mist-covered hills, long before a single crown ruled them all? To begin the story of Scotland, one must first drift back through the veils of time, back to an age when the land itself was the first kingdom, and its mountains, rivers, and seas were both barrier and guide. In that quiet, early medieval world between the 5th and 8th centuries, the land we now call Scotland was not yet one realm, but a mosaic of peoples and languages, of faiths and frontiers, of memories older than memory itself. The landscape was vast and elemental, highlands of heather and stone rising into restless clouds, lochs glimmering like fragments of sky, forests murmuring with the songs of unseen birds. Each glen, each island, seemed to belong to its own silence. Here the first Scots lived in small communities, built not upon ambition but endurance. Life was carved from the soil, the sea, and the seasons. There were no great capitals or marble palaces, only roundhouses of timber and turf, smoke curling through the dawn as families tended fires against the chill of northern winds. Among these early peoples were the Picts, whose carved stones still stand in the fields and kirkyards of the north. Their art speaks in spirals and beasts, symbols that remain mysterious, echoing an imagination rooted in the natural and the sacred. The Britons of the south, heirs to Rome's distant legacy, farmed river valleys and raised hill forts that still crown the lowlands. Across the western sea came the Gaels from Ireland, founding the small but spirited kingdom of Dalriada, its heart in Argyll, its faith carried by monks and sailors alike. To the north and east, Norse seafarers began to press upon the coasts, explorers and settlers whose presence would one day shape the islands and the tongue of the land. Each people had their gods, their chieftains, their stories. None yet called themselves Scot, but already, threads of kinship and exchange began to weave through the tapestry. Trade crossed the waters in fragile boats laden with furs, salt, and iron. Words migrated too: Gaelic, Pictish, Brittonic, creating a music of speech that still lingers in place names scattered across the map. Strath, Glen, Ben, and Inver. Through such names, we can still hear their voices whispering beneath the centuries. Archaeologists studying ancient middens along the western coast have uncovered fragments of pottery imported from the Mediterranean. Even at the edge of Europe, the ancestors of the Scots were connected to distant worlds. The fragments remind us that isolation and belonging often coexist, that even in apparent remoteness, there was always a gentle flow of ideas, faith, and craft. In this early age, nature dictated both rhythm and belief. The changing light of northern skies was seen as divine conversation. Hills and wells were thought to hold spirits, and rituals of harvest and remembrance bound the living to the land. Over generations, these beliefs softened under the light of Christianity, carried across the sea by quiet missionaries. Yet in the mists of that transformation, old and new coexisted, crosses rising beside ancient standing stones, prayers mingling with the sigh of wind through pines. To imagine these centuries is to step into stillness. There were no empires here, only survival and story. Each tribe lived by patterns of kinship, families and extended clans guided by chiefs whose rule depended less on decree than on respect. Justice was spoken, not written. Loyalty carried in memory, not law. In winter, long nights were filled with tales told by the hearth. Stories of origin, of spirits, of warriors who spoke with the sea. In such telling, identity was not a fixed border but a growing circle. Beneath the soil of Orkney and the Western Isles, archaeologists have found fragments of combs carved from whalebone and tools shaped from driftwood. They reveal a people attuned to their environment, drawing beauty and necessity from what the sea provided. The artistry of these objects, delicate, functional, and enduring, reflects a truth of early Scotland. Resilience was not born of might, but of harmony with nature. The centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of Scotland were times of quiet transformation. Across Britain, chaos reigned in some places, but in the north, the story moved more slowly, like the steady erosion of stone by rain. Out of isolation came adaptability. From hardship, faith. Villages became strongholds became small kingdoms, and among them, patterns of alliance and rivalry began to appear. The kingdom of Pictland expanded in the east, while Dalriada thrived in the west, each a mirror of the other, distinct, yet drawn by unseen gravity toward eventual union. Recent DNA studies show that despite centuries of separation, the peoples of early medieval Scotland shared deep ancestral roots. What history records as division may in truth have been kinship rediscovered through time, a reminder that nations are less forged than remembered. As the 8th century approached, change gathered like mist before sunrise. The Picts grew in strength under kings whose names now sound like echoes: Brede, Necton, Yengus. The Gaels, meanwhile, carried their language and their Christian faith across the sea, founding monasteries at Iona and Dunkeld. In the north, Norse sails began to appear more often against the horizon, heralding both trade and turmoil. The land seemed to draw breath, preparing for the slow birth of a kingdom that would one day call itself Alba. And through it all, the land remained the quiet witness. The mountains watched unchanging. The rivers continued to carve their patient paths to the sea. Every age left its imprint upon the soil, each tribe its word, its faith, its name. Together, they formed the deep foundation on which the story of Scotland would one day rise. As the first light of history touched these shores, it found not a single nation, but a chorus of lives, diverse yet united in endurance. And from their mingled songs, a destiny began to take shape. As tribes met and merged, their legends intertwined, and from the mist, a kingdom began to take shape. As the early centuries waned, Scotland's fragmented lands began to stir with the quiet rhythm of unification. Across hills and river valleys, in the lingering glow of sacred fires, a sense of shared destiny slowly emerged. It did not arrive with sudden conquest or decree, but with generations of struggle, diplomacy, and the steady will of those who sought stability in a world forever shifting. From the interwoven lives of the Picts and Gaels came the earliest outlines of a nation. For centuries, they had coexisted as neighboring peoples, different in language and custom, yet bound by geography and faith. The Picts, masters of the northern plains, carved their symbols into stone, marks of lineage and mystery. The Gaels of Dalriada, seafarers from Ireland, brought with them a rich tongue and the soft glow of Christianity that radiated outward from Iona's sacred shores. Between them lay not just borders, but opportunities for exchange, of faith, blood, and tradition. In this delicate balance stood Kenneth MacAlpin, remembered by later generations as the first king of Scots. His reign in the mid-9th century, circa 843 CE, would come to symbolize the merging of Pictish and Gaelic worlds, though the reality was far more complex. The chronicles, written long after his time, tell of a unifier, a visionary who drew strength from both traditions to create something enduring. Whether by alliance, inheritance, or quiet conquest, Kenneth's rule over Picts and Scots marked the dawn of a new identity, the Kingdom of Alba. In those days, Alba was not yet the Scotland we imagine, but a cluster of strongholds bound by fragile loyalty. The north remained wild and uncertain, the lowlands vulnerable to invasion. Yet within its heart, the idea of unity began to take hold, a thought as bold and lasting as the stones that anchored its first royal halls. At Scone, kings would one day be crowned upon the Stone of Destiny, an artifact older than any throne, symbolizing continuity between earth and crown. Though legend shrouds its origin, its meaning was clear. Kingship in Alba was not dominion over land alone, but stewardship of a shared heritage. This new kingdom faced trials almost immediately. To the south, the growing power of the Anglo-Saxons pressed upon its borders. To the north and west, Norse settlers strengthened their footholds among the islands, blending cultures even as they contested them. The Viking Age brought both devastation and diversity, raids that scarred, and exchanges that enriched. In time, Norse words entered the Gaelic tongue. Norse craftsmanship adorned Pictish art. What began as invasion evolved, in parts, into assimilation. And yet, amid external threats, the idea of Alba endured. Each generation learned that unity was not a single act, but an unending effort. Kings rose and fell. Constantine I, Donald II, Cosentine Mac Ida, each defending a vision that was still more dream than reality. Faith, however, became the quiet thread holding this early kingdom together. Monasteries at Dunkeld and St. Andrews became centers not just of prayer, but of governance and record, where Latin and Gaelic met on the page to shape the written soul of Scotland. The rhythm of life during these centuries was slow, contemplative. Villages expanded around monastic centers, their inhabitants bound to the seasons and the soil. Farmers plowed narrow strips of land, herders moved flocks through mist-laden passes, and traders crossed dangerous waters to bring salt, wool, and faith to distant shores. The kingdom grew not by conquest but by cohesion, by learning to see diversity not as division, but as strength. In the fragile balance of Alba's early years, identity was both inherited and made. The old Pictish symbols faded from stone, replaced by crosses and script. The Gaelic tongue spread across the royal court, shaping law and ceremony. Yet the memory of the Picts endured, not as a vanquished people, but as roots absorbed into the growing tree of a new civilization. Alba was, in essence, a fusion born not of erasure, but of remembrance. It is tempting to imagine those early kings as distant figures of power, but their rule was often tenuous, their reach limited. Beyond their halls lay vast territories governed by custom and kinship, where the voice of the crown was faint against the echo of tradition. Still, their ambition left a mark, the belief that these disparate lands could one day move as one, that the same wind which touched the isles might stir the fields of Fife and the forests of Moray. In time, that belief took form in law, in lineage, in worship. Alba's kings began to style themselves not merely rulers of Scots or Picts, but of a broader realm, custodians of a land bound by shared destiny. The term Scotland would not yet be used, but its essence had been born. Beneath the surface of everyday life, something enduring had begun to hum. A unity older than politics, softer than conquest, deeper than creed. As the 9th century gave way to the 10th, Alba stood firm against its storms. Raids came and went. Alliances fractured and reformed. But through the haze of time, one truth remained. A kingdom had taken its first breath. Its heart, though young and uncertain, beat with quiet determination. And in that rhythm, between hill and sea, between language and faith, the identity of a people began to unfold, patient and strong, like the slow rise of dawn over a land destined to remember its name. Yet unity, once born, must learn to endure, through kings, invasions, and faith. As the mists of early medieval Scotland began to clear, another force swept quietly through its glens and isles, a faith carried not by conquerors, but by pilgrims. Long before stone cathedrals and royal chapels, there were small fires on the western shores, lit by monks who sought to bring light into wildness. From these flames, Christianity took root in Scotland, shaping not just belief, but identity itself. It was on the tiny island of Iona, off the rugged coast of Mull, that one of history's gentlest revolutions began. In the year 563 CE, St. Columba, an exiled Irish monk of noble birth, arrived with a handful of followers. Their wooden boats had crossed treacherous waters, driven less by ambition than by calling. Here, amid wind and sea, they founded a monastery, a beacon of learning and faith. From this small sanctuary, word and wisdom spread across the north. Columba's mission was neither forceful nor grand. The conversion of the Picts and Gaels unfolded as a dialogue between old ways and new hopes. The monks of Iona did not destroy the sacred groves or silence the songs of the Druids. Instead, they wove Christian meaning into the existing fabric of reverence for nature, ancestry, and the unseen. Over generations, crosses rose beside ancient standing stones, each carving a bridge between two worlds. In this period, faith became a language not one of domination but of understanding. The Celtic Church, distinct from Roman authority, emphasized community, humility, and contemplation. Monasteries were not citadels, but gardens of thought, where scripture was copied by hand on parchment and prayers mingled with the sound of the sea. Iona's monks trained missionaries who would travel to distant kingdoms, to Northumbria, to Ireland, and deep into the highlands, spreading not fear, but fascination. Their Christianity carried the fragrance of the landscape itself. Austere, poetic, intimate. It was a faith of wind and water, of solitude and song. The Psalms were sung in Gaelic, the Gospels illuminated with spirals reminiscent of Pictish art. In these illuminated manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells, believed to have been inspired by Iona's artistry, we glimpse the fusion of faith and culture that defined early Scottish spirituality. As word of Iona spread, so too did its influence. Kings and chieftains sought the blessing of the church, understanding that divine approval lent legitimacy to temporal power. In return, the monasteries found patronage and protection. This symbiosis between crown and cross became one of the enduring patterns of Scottish history. Even before the kingdom was politically whole, it was spiritually bound, through the quiet rhythm of prayer and the written word. The coming of faith also brought literacy and record, tools that would preserve memory long after voices were gone. The monks chronicled the lives of kings, the signs of comets, the ebb and flow of war and peace. Through them, Scotland began to see itself not only as a land, but as a story, one that could be told, shaped, and remembered. But faith did not arrive unchallenged. The Norsemen, who began to settle the western isles and northern coasts, brought their own gods of thunder and sea. Their raids sometimes shattered monasteries, scattering relics and scrolls into the tide. Yet even they, in time, felt the quiet pull of this new faith. Across generations, the descendants of raiders knelt beside those they once plundered, united by belief rather than blood. In this slow conversion, Scotland absorbed Norse strength into its spiritual heart. Through these centuries of transition, faith became more than religion, it became a shared rhythm of life. Churches were built of timber and stone, their bells marking time in villages where the world otherwise changed little. Pilgrims journeyed to sacred wells, believing that the divine lingered not far from the earth itself. Even the landscape began to carry echoes of devotion. Hills named for saints, lochs for miracles, valleys for hermits who once prayed there in solitude. By the dawn of the 10th century, Scotland's Christianity had grown both local and learned. It was no longer the quiet frontier of Iona alone. It had spread to Dunkeld, Abernethy, and St. Andrews, each becoming a center of worship and scholarship. There, relics were venerated, Latin was studied, and the lineage of kings intertwined ever more deeply with the Church's blessing. The faith that began in isolation had become the soul of a nation in formation. And yet, even as Christianity united the people, it did not erase the mist of mystery from the land. Old beliefs lingered, folded gently into new prayers, a duality that would define Scottish spirituality for centuries to come. To walk through these early centuries is to feel that balance. A people neither conquered by faith nor entirely remade by it, but transformed through quiet merging. The cross stood not as a weapon, but as a witness to endurance, humility, and hope. As the light of faith spread across the land, so too did the seeds of unity, preparing Scotland for the trials and transformations that lay ahead. The story of Scotland cannot be told without the sea, for it was along the restless waters that both peril and promise arrived. In the late 8th century, sails began to appear on the northern horizon, pale against the gray expanse of sky and surf. They belonged to the Norsemen, explorers, raiders, and settlers whose coming would reshape the Western Isles and northern coasts for centuries to come. To the monks of Iona, they first appeared as storms incarnate. In 795 CE, their ships struck without warning, their axes falling upon the holy isle that had long been a beacon of peace. Yet the Vikings did not come as destroyers alone. With each raid came settlement. With settlement, adaptation. The very waters that separated the Gaelic and Norse worlds soon became the channels through which their destinies intertwined. The Norse were drawn to Scotland not simply for plunder, but for its abundance, its fertile pastures, its sheltered bays, and its access to the North Atlantic routes that led to Ireland, Iceland, and beyond. They settled the Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland, leaving their mark upon every inlet and promontory. In these places, their language mingled with Gaelic, producing names still heard today, places ending in ey for island, or ness for headland. Even in modern speech, traces of Old Norse echo faintly across the land. In these borderlands between worlds, something remarkable happened. Rather than endless war, there grew a strange coexistence, part rivalry, part kinship. Intermarriage between Norse settlers and Gaelic families gave rise to a blended people. The Gaelgaedheil, or foreign Gaels. They spoke both tongues, followed both customs, and came to embody the resilient, hybrid nature of Scotland itself. Art and law, too, bore witness to this meeting of minds. Norse knotwork adorned Pictish stones. Gaelic poets sang of sea kings whose rule extended from sky to man. Norse ting assemblies, gatherings to settle disputes, found echoes in later Scottish local councils. Even the governance of the Isles reflected this fusion. Norse jarls ruled with the consent of local chieftains, blending Scandinavian pragmatism with Celtic tradition. The Kingdom of the Isles, stretching across the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, became the most visible symbol of this hybrid culture. Its rulers, often of mixed descent, owed loose allegiance to both Norway and the emerging Scottish crown, playing one against the other to preserve autonomy. Though their loyalty was fluid, their culture was firm, a maritime identity that saw no boundary between sea and land, between Norse and Gael. Life in these northern reaches was both harsh and poetic. Long winters bound communities together, their halls filled with storytelling and song. The sagas of the Norse blended with Gaelic legend, giving rise to tales of heroes who sailed between worlds, guided by faith and fate alike. The sea was both pathway and peril, the giver of trade and the taker of lives. Fishermen, farmers, and warriors alike lived at its mercy, their rhythms shaped by tide and season. Yet, even amid this fragile harmony, the Norse presence challenged the heartland of Alba. Viking raids struck deep into mainland territories, testing the resolve of Scottish kings. Monasteries were burned, markets plundered, and coastlines scarred by conflict. Still, each assault forced the kingdom to strengthen its unity, to look inward for resilience. The very act of surviving these invasions became a crucible in which Scottish identity was tempered. By the 10th century, the Norse world had stretched from Norway to North America, but in Scotland, its influence was no longer one of domination. The lines between invader and inhabitant blurred. Norse farmers tilled Gaelic soil. Gaelic priests baptized Norse children. Stone crosses rose where Thor's hammer once stood, marking the quiet triumph of adaptation over annihilation. The Orkneyinga saga, written later in Iceland, would recall this era with admiration and melancholy. It spoke of jarls who ruled with courage and cunning, of voyages across storm-laden seas, of alliances sealed by blood and broken by ambition. Though written from afar, its verses carried the voice of a shared heritage, proof that these islanders had become something neither wholly Norse nor wholly Scots, but unmistakably their own. The legacy of these centuries lingers not only in names and ruins but in the temperament of the people. The northern spirit, independent, enduring, and fiercely tied to the sea, remains one of Scotland's defining characteristics. In every harbor and island village, echoes of that mingling still whisper through the salt wind. The Vikings came as shadows, yet left behind light, the light of exchange, of endurance, of transformation. Their presence carved depth into Scotland's story, reminding future generations that identity is never static but shaped, again and again, by the meeting of worlds. But even as the seas brought strangers, the heart of the land turned inward, toward power and order. In the centuries following Kenneth MacAlpin's unification, the throne of Alba was less a seat of absolute power than a fragile bond of trust, a balance between clans, faith, and fate. Kings ruled not from gilded halls but from timbered fortresses, their crowns weighed by obligation more than glory. Across these rugged lands, kingship was still learning to breathe, a rhythm of endurance shaped by uncertain borders and restless neighbors. Among the earliest monarchs to shape this fledgling realm was Constantine II, who reigned from 900 to 943 CE. His long rule marked a turning point, when Alba began to look beyond survival and toward structure. Constantine inherited a kingdom still testing its edges, menaced by Norse incursions from the north and English pressure from the south. Yet he proved a shrewd and patient ruler, preferring diplomacy where war would fail. Under his guidance, Alba developed the first faint outline of administration, councils of nobles, laws drawn from both Gaelic and Christian precedent, and a recognition of the Church's stabilizing influence. It was during Constantine's time that Scotland first appeared in the annals of England not as a wilderness, but as a nation among nations. The king's alliance with the Church, particularly his cooperation with bishops and abbots, gave legitimacy to his reign. The fusion of sacred and secular authority was delicate but necessary. Constantine understood that unity of faith could knit together what borders could not. He abdicated late in life, retreating to a monastery at St. Andrews, an act that symbolized both piety and fatigue. In his choice of peace over power, the kingdom glimpsed the quiet nobility that would mark many of its rulers to come. The generations that followed would test the endurance of his legacy. Alba's kings faced constant threats from without and within: rival claimants, Norse jarls, and the ambitions of the rising English crown. Yet through these storms, the idea of Scotland endured. Malcolm II, who reigned from 1005 to 1034, would become one of its first true architects. Malcolm's reign was marked by both consolidation and conflict. His early years were defined by battle, the clash of rival dynasties that had inherited the Gaelic system of tanistry, where succession was based not solely on birth, but on election among eligible kin. This tradition, though intended to prevent tyranny, often invited bloodshed. Malcolm navigated it with calculated strength, eliminating threats and expanding his influence into regions that had long resisted royal oversight. Under his leadership, Alba began to take on the recognizable shape of a kingdom that would one day be Scotland. He secured Lothian, the fertile borderland between Scots and Angles, through diplomacy and war, giving the crown a foothold that would later anchor Edinburgh's rise. His rule marked the waning of purely Gaelic kingship and the slow adoption of European norms. Feudal ties, recorded charters, and alliances sealed through marriage. These were not the grand gestures of empire, but the steady strokes of statecraft, quiet decisions that stitched together a fragile realm. Malcolm's death left no sons, but his lineage survived through his daughter, Bethic, whose marriage to Crianan of Dunkeld would unite two powerful families, the royal line and the ecclesiastical. From this union came Duncan I, whose reign would forever echo in legend. Duncan's rule, beginning in 1034, represented a new generation's hope for stability. Unlike his forebears, he inherited rather than seized the throne, a small miracle in a land accustomed to contention. Yet peace remained elusive. Duncan's leadership was earnest but inexperienced, and his reign soon faced the ambition of a formidable cousin. Macbeth had Mac Finelake, better known as Macbeth. The historical Duncan was no weak ruler, nor Macbeth merely a villain. Their conflict reflected the complex fabric of early Scottish politics, a system where loyalty flowed through kinship more than crown. Duncan sought to extend royal influence into the north, where local rulers still held sway. Macbeth, representing that northern power, resisted. In 1040, at the battle near Elgin, Duncan fell, and with him the illusion of uncontested kingship. Yet even in this turmoil, Alba did not fracture. Macbeth ascended the throne not as usurper in the eyes of his age, but as a legitimate contender, ruling with surprising effectiveness for over a decade. Later chronicles, colored by legend and Shakespeare's verse, would remember him as tyrant and murderer. But in truth, his reign brought reform, pilgrimage, and a measure of order. His fall and the restoration of Duncan's line under Malcolm III would mark the dawn of medieval Scotland proper, a realm no longer merely surviving, but defining its destiny. Through Constantine, Malcolm, and Duncan, the kingdom of Alba matured in silence and struggle. It was not empire but endurance that shaped it, not conquest, but the patient weaving of culture and law. In their slow transformation from chieftains to monarchs, Scotland's early kings learned that true power lay not in domination, but in continuity. In the glow of firelight, they ruled a land still half legend, a patchwork of tribes and faiths stitched together by vision and resolve. Each decision, each alliance, each prayer whispered in the dim halls of Scone or Dunkeld, carried forward the fragile thread of nationhood. From fragile rule would rise a legend, a king whose story would echo across centuries. Long before his name became a whisper of treachery and blood, Macbeth was a man of his time, a king of Alba whose reign brought order to a turbulent land. The world remembers him through Shakespeare's quill, yet the real Macbeth story is quieter, more human, and far more dignified. To understand him is to step back into the 11th century, when Scotland was still learning the language of kingship, and when a ruler's worth was measured not in ambition, but in endurance. Macbeth's lineage was noble, his claim to the throne legitimate. Born around the year 1005, he was the grandson of King Malcolm II and married to Gruch, a descendant of Kenneth III. In a time when royal bloodlines tangled like forest roots, his right to rule was neither sudden nor stolen. When Duncan I fell in battle in 1040, a common fate for kings in that age, Macbeth's ascension followed the ancient Gaelic tradition of tanistry, where succession passed to the most capable among the royal kin, not necessarily the eldest son. In the years that followed, Macbeth governed not as tyrant, but as reformer. His rule, lasting 17 years, was unusually stable for the era. He strengthened law and order, curbed the power of rival nobles, and restored authority to the crown. Chronicles from later centuries would remember that Scotland prospered under his hand. For once, peace outlasted the seasons. Beyond Alba's borders, Macbeth sought to align his kingdom with the broader Christian world. In 1050, he is recorded as having journeyed to Rome, an extraordinary act for a Scottish king of his age. There, he made generous offerings to the poor, and his pilgrimage marked Scotland's first tangible step into continental diplomacy. This journey revealed a ruler not cloaked in superstition, but guided by faith and vision. A monarch aware that his realm, though remote, was part of a wider European story. The image of Macbeth the Pilgrim stands in stark contrast to the specter of ambition immortalized on the stage. The Shakespearean tragedy, written 6 centuries later, drew from Holinshed's chronicles, which themselves borrowed rumor from political propaganda. The dramatist needed a villain. History offers instead a reformer whose rule was marked by moderation and strength. Macbeth's court at Dunsinane and Inverness would have been places of ceremony and council, where monks, warriors, and lords gathered to discuss the governance of a maturing kingdom. His queen, Gruch, played a significant role, not the scheming figure of fiction, but a patron of the church, remembered in monastic records for her piety and support of holy foundations. Together, they represented a union of ancient lines, binding the northern and southern branches of the royal blood. Under Macbeth's rule, Alba's ties to the Norse Gaelic west and the Anglo-Saxon south remained complex but manageable. The Norse earls of Orkney continued to rule their seas, while trade and diplomacy flourished across the firths. Within the heartland, agriculture expanded, and monasteries regained stability after decades of strife. Even the chroniclers who would later write under the victor's shadow could not deny that his reign brought a rare calm to the kingdom. Yet, peace in medieval Scotland was always provisional, a thread too easily frayed by bloodlines and ambition. In 1054, Seward, the powerful Earl of Northumbria, led an English invasion under the banner of restoring Duncan's exiled son, Malcolm Canmore. Macbeth repelled the attack but suffered heavy losses. 3 years later, in 1057, Malcolm returned, leading another campaign that ended at Lumphanan in Aberdeenshire. There, Macbeth fell in battle, a king to the last, defending the realm he had steadied for nearly 2 decades. His death was not the end of a villain's arc, but the closing of an era. The chronicles tell of his burial on Iona, among the sacred kings of old, a final testament to the respect he commanded in life. His stepson, Lulach, briefly held the crown, but the tides of history had turned. Within months, Malcolm III would rise, founding a dynasty that would transform Alba into the Scotland of medieval memory. In truth, Macbeth's greatest legacy was not conquest or wealth, but continuity. He preserved what others had built, strengthened what was fragile, and bridged the age of Gaelic kingship with the dawn of feudal rule. His Scotland was one of transition, where the old ways met the new, and where governance began to reach beyond survival. When Shakespeare later turned his story into a tale of ambition and guilt, he gave the world poetry, but he took from Scotland a king who had sought balance, not blood. The real Macbeth was a man who governed with restraint, worshipped with sincerity, and walked the long road to Rome not for power, but for peace. And so, in the quiet spaces between myth and memory, the true king still stands, not with dagger drawn, but with the calm dignity of a ruler who held his nation steady against the winds of change. As one age ends in legend, another dawns in ambition, the age of dynasties and divided loyalties. When Macbeth fell at Lumphanan in 1057, the mists of Scotland seemed to part for a new dawn. Malcolm Canmore, son of Duncan I, returned from exile with the backing of the English crown and the will to rebuild. His rise marked not only a change in kingship but a quiet evolution in the soul of Scotland itself. The land had known warriors. Now it would know rulers who shaped faith, law, and the very rhythm of its people's lives. Malcolm's reign, beginning in 1058, followed years of conflict and uncertainty. The scars of internal strife still ran deep across the glens and coasts, but he approached power with a vision that balanced strength with stability. The Gaelic traditions of his forebears remained alive, yet Malcolm was no longer a purely Celtic monarch. Having spent years at the English court, he had seen a world of ceremony, structure, and diplomacy, lessons he brought northward. It was, however, his marriage that would define this new chapter of the Scottish story. Around 1070, Malcolm wed Margaret of Wessex, a princess of English royal blood. Margaret had fled to Scotland after the Norman conquest, her ship driven ashore by fate and storm. What began as refuge became destiny. Together, they forged a partnership that wove gentleness into governance and piety into policy. In Dunfermline, their court became a sanctuary of faith and culture. Margaret, refined and devout, carried the grace of continental Christianity, its rituals, learning, and reformist spirit. She sought to align the Scottish Church with the wider traditions of Rome, bringing its isolated monastic customs closer to the heart of Europe. The reforms she championed were not acts of power, but of devotion. The regularization of the Sabbath, the observance of Lent, and the introduction of new liturgies that reflected a broader Christian unity. Through her influence, the court softened. Monks, scholars, and craftsmen found patronage, and the early roots of Scotland's medieval scholarship began to grow. She founded Dunfermline Abbey, which would stand for centuries as a resting place of kings and queens, a monument to a queen whose piety shaped a nation's conscience. Those who met her spoke of her charity, her fasting, her care for the poor. It is said that she rose before dawn each day to pray and distribute food to orphans and widows, her devotion radiating from the quiet halls of her palace. Malcolm, in turn, was not untouched by her example. Though he remained a man of battle, strong, impulsive, and sometimes fierce, he revered his queen. The chronicles describe a ruler who could not read but kept her prayer book close, kissing the pages she studied. In their union, one finds a harmony between earth and spirit, a warrior king guided by a saintly heart. Politically, Malcolm's reign was shaped by his uneasy relationship with England. The Norman kings, newly established after 1066, saw Scotland as both refuge and rival. Malcolm offered asylum to English nobles displaced by William the Conqueror, yet this gesture brought inevitable tension. Raids and negotiations alternated across the borderlands, with peace secured only through diplomacy and, later, through blood. In 1093, while defending his frontier against Norman forces, Malcolm was slain near Alnwick in Northumberland, his eldest son Edward falling beside him. Margaret, frail and ill, received the news days later. The grief was said to be too great to bear. Within 3 days, she too passed from this world, dying in prayer. Her last act was one of surrender, not to despair, but to faith. In her, Scotland saw the embodiment of Christian virtue. In him, the embodiment of royal courage. Their legacy, however, did not fade with them. The line they began, the House of Canmore, would rule Scotland for 2 centuries, guiding it through wars, reformations, and Renaissance. Under their descendants, the kingdom's foundations grew stronger, its laws more refined, its faith more deeply rooted in the broader Christian world. The blend of Gaelic resilience and Anglo-Saxon order forged by Malcolm and Margaret became the essence of medieval Scotland's character. When Pope Innocent IV canonized Margaret in 1250, she became Saint Margaret of Scotland, the nation's spiritual matron. Her sanctity was not born of miracles or conquest, but of compassion and constancy, the kind of holiness that weaves itself into the daily lives of people and endures through centuries. Her memory still lingers in the stones of Dunfermline, where her relics once rested beside the tomb of her husband, the warrior king who loved her. Together, Malcolm and Margaret transformed a land once fractured by clans and conquest into a kingdom with a soul. Their reign bridged the old and the new, uniting Celtic heart with European mind, battle spirit with spiritual grace. With faith secure, Scotland turned outward, toward its neighbors and the long shadow of England. In the quiet years following the deaths of Malcolm and Margaret, the kingdom they had nurtured entered a new phase, one defined less by sword and spirit, and more by structure. The world beyond Scotland's borders was changing rapidly. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a new power rose to dominance south of the border, a people who built not just empires but institutions. Their mark would soon cross the Tweed and reshape Scotland from within. At first, Norman influence came through blood and marriage. The sons of Malcolm and Margaret had English and Norman kin, and through them came a steady flow of courtiers, clerics, and craftsmen. King David I, who ruled from 1124 to 1153, became the quiet architect of this transformation. Having spent much of his youth in the Anglo-Norman court, he absorbed its customs and values, chivalry, administration, and the vision of a kingdom governed through law as much as loyalty. When David ascended to the throne, he began to invite Norman lords northward, granting them lands in exchange for allegiance. These men, trained in the feudal order, brought with them new methods of governance, and the skills to shape the landscape in stone. Feudalism slowly replaced the looser Celtic systems of kinship. Nobles held their estates not by ancient right, but by royal grant. In return, they owed military service and counsel to the crown. It was a system that brought both order and hierarchy, weaving Scotland into the broader fabric of medieval Europe. The visual symbol of this change was unmistakable: the castle. Across the lowlands and along key routes northward, Norman-style fortifications rose. Motte and Bailey constructions of earth and timber at first, later replaced by towers of stone. These structures were not just defensive but declarative. They proclaimed authority, permanence, and the presence of royal power in a land once ruled by shifting alliances. Edinburgh, Stirling, and Roxburgh became centers of this new architecture of rule, each castle standing as both fortress and administrative hub. Within their walls, the rhythms of governance grew more formal. The charter became a common instrument of law, written grants sealed by wax, recorded by scribes, and witnessed by noble hands. Through these documents, Scotland's medieval bureaucracy began to take shape. What once was spoken custom became written decree, a quiet revolution in how authority was expressed and remembered. The church, too, was transformed under Norman influence. Bishops and abbots from continental orders, Augustinians, Cistercians, and Benedictines, established monasteries that became centers of learning and literacy. The great abbeys of Melrose, Kelso, and Dunfermline thrived, their cloisters filled with the sounds of prayer and penmanship. These institutions did more than serve faith. They preserved history, educated the sons of nobles, and connected Scotland to the intellectual pulse of Europe. Yet, this transformation was not without tension. The Gaelic nobility of the Highlands and Western Isles, bound by older traditions of kinship and inheritance, viewed the feudal order with quiet suspicion. To them, the newcomers represented not refinement but intrusion, a reshaping of their ancient freedoms. The cultural divide between Highland and Lowland deepened, setting the stage for centuries of contrast between clan and crown. Still, the Norman system brought undeniable strength. Roads and bridges improved, markets expanded, and towns flourished under royal protection. Places like Perth, Dundee, and Berwick grew into vibrant burghs, centers of trade where merchants from Flanders, France, and the Baltic exchanged goods under the watchful eye of royal charters. These burghs became symbols of an emerging civic identity. Scotland as a kingdom not just of warriors, but of builders, traders, and scribes. In the courts of David and his successors, one can imagine the mingling of tongues, Gaelic, Norman French, Latin, and early Scots, each carrying traces of heritage and adaptation. The royal household itself became a microcosm of this blending. Norman knights in shining mail sharing space with Celtic thanes who traced their lineage to the mists of Dalriada. Through these quiet revolutions, in law, in stone, and in thought, Scotland stepped into the European world without surrendering its own essence. The Norman influence did not erase the Celtic spirit. It gave it form, language, and endurance. Where once stood wooden halls of kings now rose stone keeps, and where custom once ruled by memory, parchment preserved the word of law. The transformation was profound yet peaceful, a slow layering of cultures that would give Scotland both structure and strength for the trials ahead. The castles that crowned its hills were more than fortresses. They were symbols of order in a land of winds and mists, built not by conquest alone but by design, purpose, and faith in endurance. And yet, every stone laid for order also cast a shadow, one that would one day fall across the borderlands. By the middle of the 12th century, the Kingdom of Scotland was changing in ways its early kings could scarcely have imagined. The age of mere survival had given way to one of structure, vision, and permanence. Through the patient work of rulers like David I, the fragile framework of the crown began to solidify, not through sweeping conquest, but through quiet, deliberate reform. David's legacy was not written in epic battles but in charters, abbeys, and burghs. Under his reign, the rhythm of royal life took on a new order, one defined by record and ritual. He strengthened the monarchy not by claiming divine grandeur, but by giving shape to its institutions. Laws were codified, lands were measured and granted with seals and witnesses, and the word of the king became more than spoken authority. It became law preserved in ink and wax. Across the kingdom, the growth of burghs, royal trading towns, signaled a profound shift. Edinburgh, Roxburgh, Stirling, and Perth became hubs of commerce, protected by the crown and governed by burgh charters that defined rights and duties. Merchants thrived under royal peace, their goods flowing through new markets that connected Scotland to the wider world. From the harbors of Berwick came wool bound for Flanders and grain bound for Norway. A new class of townspeople emerged, artisans, merchants, and craftsmen. People whose fortunes rested not on lineage, but on skill and enterprise. At the same time, monastic life reached a golden age. The abbeys of Melrose, Jedburgh, and Arbroath became centers of not only devotion but also development. Monks drained lands, built mills, and introduced advanced agricultural practices from continental Europe. Their libraries copied texts, their scribes preserved laws, and their abbots advised kings. In their quiet way, these monastic communities were building the intellectual and administrative backbone of the nation. David and his successors also encouraged the Church's integration with Rome, ensuring that bishops and abbots aligned their governance with European canon law. This brought discipline and unity, but also a subtle independence of spirit, a confidence that Scotland's faith could stand alongside, not beneath, that of any realm. The sanctity of St. Margaret continued to guide royal conscience, her example echoing through each act of reform. Yet beneath the calm of parchment and prayer, Scotland's position remained precarious. Its crown was growing stronger, but its independence, ever shadowed by England, was far from secure. The Norman kings to the south still saw Scotland as a frontier to be influenced, if not ruled. Treaties were drawn, hostages exchanged, and marriages arranged, each act binding Scotland more tightly to the currents of English politics. Alexander I and David I navigated these complexities with care, balancing homage to the English crown with the assertion of Scottish sovereignty. Their diplomacy was cautious but firm, an art of survival cloaked in courtesy. Even so, the edges of the realm remained contested, particularly in Northumbria and Cumbria, where loyalties blurred and borderlands shifted with every generation. Culturally, too, the kingdom was finding its balance. In the lowlands, French and Latin were the languages of court and record. In the highlands, Gaelic still carried the song of ancestry. The crown's reach was strongest where roads and rivers flowed, weaker in the mountain glens where clan ties and oral law endured. Scotland was becoming two lands within one crown, a duality that would define its character for centuries to come. But despite its divisions, the 12th century saw a growing sense of identity, a consciousness that this realm, perched at the northern edge of Christendom, was something distinct and enduring. Its kings were no longer tribal warlords or foreign princes. They were guardians of a nation's continuity, bound by oath, seal, and faith. This Scotland was a land of contrasts, of castles and crofts, monasteries and markets, Gaelic chieftains and Norman knights. Its strength lay not in uniformity, but in its ability to weave difference into durability. And through its growing institutions, the kingdom began to speak with a unified voice, one measured not in the noise of battle, but in the calm authority of governance. By the time of William the Lion and Alexander II, Scotland had become recognizable as a medieval state, its borders roughly drawn, its crown recognized by Europe, its people bound by shared allegiance to both land and law. Still, its peace was always fragile. For in the centuries to come, that delicate balance would be tested by ambition, invasion, and the enduring question of sovereignty. But peace in parchment was only temporary, for war was stirring once more. The winter of 1286 brought a silence that lingered like mist over the kingdom of Scotland. On a stormy night near Kinghorn in Fife, King Alexander III rode through the darkness to reach his young queen. His horse stumbled on the cliffs, and by dawn, the monarch who had ruled for more than 3 decades lay dead. The crown, so carefully steadied through years of prosperity and reform, was suddenly without a head to bear it. Under Alexander's reign, Scotland had flourished. The land was at peace, trade with Europe thrived, and royal authority stretched from the borders to the islands. He was a king remembered not for wars, but for stability, a ruler who embodied the confidence of a nation finally at ease with itself. Yet all that strength rested upon one fragile foundation, the royal line. His wife and sons had died before him, leaving only a granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, a child of 3, as the sole heir to the throne. Her claim was legitimate, but her age and distance posed dangers. Across the sea in Norway, she was beloved by her father, King Eric, yet to the Scots she was a hope wrapped in uncertainty. When Alexander's death was confirmed, the nobles and clergy gathered to preserve order. They formed a regency of guardians, 6 men charged with protecting the realm and ensuring the line of succession. For a time, Scotland held its breath. The guardians sought peace through diplomacy, arranging for young Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, to travel to Scotland and take her place as queen. To secure the succession and prevent bloodshed, they turned to England's King Edward I, a monarch whose ambition and power were already legendary. Edward proposed a marriage between his son, the future Edward II, and Margaret, a union that could join the two kingdoms under one family, though not yet under one crown. It was a delicate balance. Scotland wished for peace, but not dependence. The Treaty of Bergam in 1290 promised just that. It declared that even if the royal houses were united, Scotland would remain free, governed by its own laws and institutions. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that diplomacy might preserve both stability and sovereignty. But fate intervened. As the ship carrying the Maid of Norway crossed the North Sea, illness struck. She never reached her homeland. Word of her death at Orkney spread slowly, carried from coast to coast by rumor and grief. Across the abbeys and burghs, bells tolled in mourning, not only for a child, but for the kingdom's future. With her passing, Scotland's line of succession was broken, and with it came chaos. 13 claimants emerged, each tracing descent from earlier kings. The two principal rivals were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the man who would later define the age. Their claims divided the nobility, and old loyalties fractured into factions. The Guardians, unable to resolve the dispute, turned again to Edward I of England, inviting him to arbitrate. It was a decision made in fear of civil war, but it would open the door to something far more perilous. Edward, ever the strategist, agreed to mediate on one condition, that he be recognized as Lord Paramount of Scotland, superior over its kings and nobles. The Scottish magnates, under pressure, hesitated yet yielded, hoping it was a formality that could later be undone. But for Edward, this was no mere claim of honor, it was the foundation for dominion. Under his supervision, a great court was assembled at Berwick-upon-Tweed in 1291, where the rival claimants stood before him. Records were drawn, witnesses summoned, genealogies examined. For months the process dragged on, a spectacle of order masking the quiet erosion of independence. In 1292, Edward delivered his judgment. The crown would pass to John Balliol, whose lineage was closest by law. Balliol was crowned at Scone, but he was king in name only. Edward's overlordship loomed over every decree, every seal. The new monarch was compelled to pay homage to the English crown, and his council was subject to interference from London. What had begun as arbitration became subjugation. The people of Scotland, proud, wary, and steeped in centuries of self-rule, felt the unease grow. The crown's silence had been filled not by unity, but by shadow. Still, amid the turmoil, a quiet defiance stirred. In abbeys and halls, whispers spread that sovereignty was not a gift to be granted, nor a chain to be borne. Though the line of kings had faltered, the spirit of the realm remained. The people were learning that their freedom was not tied to one monarch's blood, but to the will of the nation itself. And so, from the hush of crisis, the first embers of resistance began to glow, faint at first, but soon to burn with a light that even kings could not contain. Yet from the hush of crisis arose voices unwilling to yield, voices that would define a people. When King John Balliol was forced to bow before Edward I and then stripped of his crown, Scotland fell into a silence that was not peace, but humiliation. English sheriffs governed Scottish towns. Foreign garrisons occupied its castles. The royal seal, once the symbol of sovereignty, was replaced by the mark of an overlord. What had been a proud kingdom became, in the eyes of Edward's court, a vassal land. Yet beneath this imposed order, something restless stirred. In the quiet of the glens and the smoky halls of the burghs, the people spoke not of surrender, but of endurance. The sense of identity that had been forming through centuries of struggle, Gaelic, Norse, Norman, and Briton blended into one, now found its unity in defiance. Out of this landscape of oppression rose a man who would become the embodiment of that defiance, William Wallace. Little is known with certainty about Wallace's early life. Chroniclers suggest he was of minor nobility, born near Elderslie in Renfrewshire. Yet his legend grew far beyond lineage. To the common people, he was not a lord's son or a knight's heir. He was one of them. A man of the land, shaped by its hardships, fluent in its silences. When English soldiers occupied his homeland, when they mocked its customs and seized its harvests. Wallace's anger was not ambition. It was belonging, awakened. The spark came in 1297, when Wallace struck against English authority at Lanark, killing the local sheriff who had wronged him and his kin. What began as personal vengeance swiftly became the rallying cry of a nation. Men gathered under his banner, farmers, craftsmen, and disinherited knights. From forest and field they came, bound not by coin but by conviction. The rebellion spread like wind through the heather, swift and uncontrollable. In that same year, Wallace joined forces with Andrew de Moray, a noble from the north who had also risen against the English. Together, they became twin flames of resistance, one from the lowlands, one from the highlands, united by purpose. Their armies converged near the River Forth, where the fate of Scotland would tremble upon a wooden bridge. At Stirling Bridge, on the morning of September 11, 1297, English forces under the Earl of Surrey approached, heavily armed, confident, and vastly superior in number. The Scots, lightly equipped, waited upon the northern bank, watching the long line of English soldiers cross the narrow bridge. The strategy was as simple as it was brilliant. Allow just enough of the enemy to cross, then strike swiftly. When the signal was given, Wallace's men surged forward, cutting off the bridge and trapping the vanguard. Panic rippled through the English ranks. Horses plunged into the water. Men were crushed beneath armor. The river ran red with the tide of defeat. It was a triumph born not of might, but of cunning and courage. Scotland, for the first time in years, had struck a decisive blow for its freedom. Word of the victory spread across the kingdom, carried by travelers, monks, and merchants. To those who had lived under occupation, Wallace's name became a beacon, a whisper of hope that the nation's soul had not been extinguished. In the months that followed, Wallace's stature grew. He was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the absent king's stead. Yet his rule was not one of pomp or pageantry. His court was a council of conviction, his authority drawn from the loyalty of those who believed. He sought not vengeance, but restoration, the return of Scotland's dignity. Still, the odds were immense. Edward I, enraged by the rebellion, marched north with an army that dwarfed any Scotland could muster. In 1298, at the Battle of Falkirk, the two forces met. The Scots fought valiantly, forming their famous schiltrons. Tight circles of spearmen braced against the charge of English cavalry. For hours they held their ground, but arrows and numbers prevailed. The battle was lost. Wallace's army scattered. Defeat, however, did not destroy the movement. It deepened its meaning. Wallace resigned his guardianship, but he did not vanish. For years he continued his struggle as a fugitive and guerrilla leader, moving through forests and glens, a symbol of perseverance when hope seemed faint. He sought allies abroad, appealing to France for aid, envisioning Scotland as part of the great European tapestry of nations rather than its subject. In 1305, betrayal ended his long defiance. Captured near Glasgow, he was taken in chains to London. There, in Westminster Hall, he was tried for treason, a charge he met with calm defiance, declaring that he had never sworn allegiance to England's king. His execution was brutal, designed to make an example of rebellion. Yet even as his life was taken, his words, simple, unwavering, echoed louder than the sentence pronounced upon him. In death, Wallace became more powerful than Edward could have imagined. The chroniclers who wrote of him did not merely recount a man's rebellion. They recorded the birth of a national conscience. His courage, born not of title but of principle, endured in the hearts of those who followed. The very idea of Scotland, independent, unbowed, found its first full voice in his struggle. And though the forests that once hid him grew silent again, his spirit lingered. It lived in the quiet determination of those who rebuilt their homes after each burning. It lived in the whispered prayers of widows and monks who refused to name any but Scotland's own as king. It lived, too, in the hearts of a new generation. Men and women who had learned from Wallace that freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a trust to be defended. In time, the world would remember Wallace through the lens of legend, as the giant, the outlaw, the martyr. Yet beyond the tales and the songs, there remained the truest legacy of all, the awakening of a people's will. For through him, Scotland learned that sovereignty could be lost in silence, but reclaimed in courage. Even after the martyr's flame was extinguished, the embers of resistance glowed still, waiting for another to rise. The death of William Wallace left Scotland in a shadow of uncertainty. Leaderless, fractured, yet still unbroken. Among the nobles who now contended for the crown stood Robert the Bruce, a man whose lineage tied him to both ambition and destiny. His family's claim to the throne was old, his loyalty to Scotland unquestioned. Yet his path to kingship would be marked by blood, exile, and the long, quiet endurance of faith. Bruce was not the hero of poets at first. He was a man divided between allegiance to the English crown and devotion to his native soil, between the caution of politics and the call of conscience. For years he had wavered, watching others rise and fall. But as Edward's grip tightened and Scotland's hope dimmed, Bruce made his choice. In 1306, in the shadowed aisles of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, he met with his rival John Comyn, a powerful noble who also claimed the throne. What passed between them remains uncertain, but when the church doors opened again, Comyn lay slain before the altar. In that single moment, both sacrilege and necessity, Bruce sealed his fate. There could be no turning back. Within weeks, he was crowned King of Scots at Scone, where once the ancient kings of Alba had been anointed. The ceremony was modest, hurried, lacking the full regalia of royalty. Yet in that simplicity lay its power. A king born not of wealth or conquest, but of resolve. Edward I responded with fury. His armies swept north, and Bruce's fragile reign was shattered. Defeated at Methven, hunted through the highlands, Bruce became a fugitive. His brothers were captured and executed, his wife and daughter imprisoned. For a time, even his supporters doubted. But in the hidden glens of the West, among caves, islands, and loyal clans, Bruce endured. Legend tells that in his darkest hour, as he hid in a small hut, he watched a spider try again and again to weave its web across a beam. Each time it fell, it began anew. If at first you don't succeed, try again, the king is said to have murmured. Whether true or not, the story captures the heart of his struggle, patience as a form of courage. By 1307, fortune began to turn. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, died on his northern campaign, and his son, Edward II, lacked his father's iron will. Bruce returned from hiding, gathering men to his cause. One by one, the English garrisons fell. The forests that had sheltered Wallace now sheltered Bruce's growing army. The people, long weary of occupation, found new hope in their king's resilience. By 1314, the struggle reached its defining moment at Bannockburn, near Stirling. The English came in vast numbers, knights, archers, and men-at-arms, confident that the rebellion would be crushed once and for all. Bruce's army was smaller, less equipped, but hardened by years of survival. On the eve of battle, Bruce rode out to survey the field. A heavily armored English knight, Henry de Bohun, spurred his horse forward, lowering his lance. The challenge was sudden and deadly. As the two closed, Bruce turned aside, rose in his stirrups, and struck with his axe, splitting de Bohun's helm in a single blow. The Scots cheered, for in that act they saw not just valor, but destiny. The battle that followed was chaos. The clash of steel, the cries of men, the churn of earth and fear. Bruce's soldiers fought from trenches and tight formations, using the terrain to their advantage. The English cavalry, trapped and confused, faltered under the weight of mud and panic. By day's end, the invincible army had broken. Stirling Castle fell soon after, and Scotland stood free, not by miracle but by endurance. Victory at Bannockburn was more than a battle won. It was a declaration of being, that Scotland's heart could not be conquered by force. Yet Bruce knew that swords alone could not secure the nation's soul. What followed was a different kind of struggle, one of diplomacy, letters, and faith. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was written, a letter to the Pope, signed by the Scottish barons. It spoke not merely for a king, but for a people. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. Those words carried more weight than any weapon. They defined the Scottish cause not as rebellion, but as right. In time, they reached the ears of Europe, and even Rome could not deny their conviction. By 1328, after years of conflict, England finally recognized Scotland's independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. Robert the Bruce, now older and weary from his long campaign, saw his dream realized. The crown once lost in chaos had been restored through patience, wisdom, and unyielding faith. Bruce died the following year, in 1329, at the age of 54. His body was laid to rest in Dunfermline Abbey, but his heart, at his request, was carried by his loyal knight James Douglas toward the Holy Land. Though Douglas fell in Spain, Bruce's heart was returned and buried at Melrose Abbey. A fitting end, perhaps, for a king who had ruled not just with might, but with devotion. In Robert the Bruce, Scotland found its mirror, flawed, steadfast, and redeemed. His reign marked the end of a struggle that had lasted a generation, yet also the beginning of a deeper identity, a people bound by will, not circumstance. With peace restored, the land turned inward once again, to rebuild, to worship, and to remember. Across the green folds of medieval Scotland, faith was not confined to churches or crowns. It was woven into the very soil. Between wind-scoured cliffs and river valleys, stone sanctuaries rose like quiet sentinels, places where the human soul sought order amid the endless wild. Monasteries such as Melrose, Iona, and Arbroath stood not as fortresses of power, but as sanctuaries of time, where the sacred and the earthly met in tranquil harmony. At dawn, as mist curled across cloisters, the first chants of the divine office drifted through the air, measured, gentle, eternal. Monks, wrapped in simple woolen habits, began their day with prayer, then work. The rhythm of their lives followed a sacred clock, ora et labora. Pray and work. Between the hours of devotion, they tended to gardens, crafted medicines, taught the young, and copied manuscripts with patient precision. Inside the scriptoriums, candlelight flickered over vellum pages. Quills dipped in ink traced not only Latin scripture but fragments of older Celtic lore and histories of kings. Each stroke of the pen was a quiet act of preservation, of a world that might otherwise fade to silence. The monks were not warriors or rulers, yet their labor defended Scotland in a different way, by safeguarding its soul. Beyond the monastery walls, the same spirit touched the villages. The abbeys were not isolated worlds but living centers of community. Farmers brought grain for blessing, travelers sought shelter, and sick folk came in hope of healing. The monks offered herbs, bread, and prayer, small miracles in a hard world. Even the toll of the bell from the abbey tower marked the hours for distant fields, reminding all who heard it that time itself was sacred. Some monasteries stood on ancient holy ground, carrying echoes from before Christianity's arrival. Iona, the windswept island where St. Columba had founded his abbey centuries earlier, remained one of the most revered sites in Christendom. Pilgrims crossed treacherous seas just to touch its stones. The monks there lived simply, yet their influence radiated across Europe, proof that peace could travel farther than armies. To the north and east, Arbroath Abbey shone as a symbol of faith and nationhood. Its red sandstone arches framed prayers that reached both heaven and history. It was here, only decades earlier, that nobles had sealed the Declaration of Arbroath, proclaiming Scotland's right to freedom. Even now, its walls whispered the same conviction, that faith and freedom were not separate pursuits but reflections of the same light. Within the abbeys, faith and labor were never at odds. Monks cultivated barley, fruit trees, and healing herbs. They studied astronomy to track planting seasons. They brewed ale and baked bread for pilgrims and paupers alike. The land around the monasteries bloomed, and their orderliness contrasted with the rugged wildness beyond. Through them, Scotland learned that devotion could also mean discipline, a steady tending of life's garden, whether spiritual or soil-bound. Even art and architecture became extensions of prayer. Arched windows caught the morning sun like open palms. Carved saints stood watch over doorways, weathered but patient. Every stone carried meaning, humility, endurance, hope. In a world often defined by conflict and hardship, the monasteries offered a different kind of power. Quiet, enduring, self-contained. Faith also shaped how time was felt. The year was divided not merely by seasons but by feasts and fasts. Advent, Lent, Easter, Michaelmas. Each carried its own rhythm, blending the divine with the domestic. A peasant's prayer before a meal, the lighting of candles at dusk, the blessing of fields in spring. All were small, sacred gestures, binding heaven to earth. These were the centuries when learning slept lightly, guarded by the abbots and scribes. Long before universities took root, the abbeys were Scotland's schools. A few chosen novices learned to read and write Latin, the language of law and liturgy. Others studied music or medicine. In their illuminated manuscripts, gold leaf glowing against deep blue, one could see devotion made visible. And yet, for all their sanctity, these were not places untouched by struggle. Monasteries faced raids, fires, and famine. At times, abbots were drawn into politics or burdened by wealth. But even amid corruption or decay, the deeper rhythm of prayer endured. It was not perfection that defined them, but persistence. The same quiet strength that had carried Scotland through its wars and winters. As the evening bell tolled across the glen, monks gathered once more in the dim light of the chapel. The chant of Compline, the final prayer of the day, rose and fell like breath. Outside, darkness settled softly over the land. From the hills to the shore, the kingdom slept under the watch of stone crosses and the gentle hum of devotion. For centuries, these monastic voices would be Scotland's conscience, guiding not by decree, but by example. In their silence, the people found steadiness. In their labor, continuity. In their faith, peace. From prayer to plowshare, faith guided every gesture, even in the humblest of homes. In the soft glow of dawn, a thin wisp of smoke curled from the thatched rooftops of a Scottish village. The day began not with haste, but with rhythm. A rhythm born of land, labor, and sky. For most of medieval Scotland's people, life was measured not by kings or battles, but by seasons and soil. A typical village sat nestled near a stream or at the edge of arable land, where fertile earth could be coaxed into sustaining the community. Cottages of wattle and daub, roofed in straw or heather, stood in small clusters, often circling a communal green or churchyard. The air carried the mingled sense of peat smoke, livestock, and damp earth, an atmosphere as ancient as the hills themselves. At the heart of village life was the farm. Men and women worked side by side, tilling, sowing, and harvesting under skies that could be both generous and unforgiving. Wooden plows, drawn by oxen, carved slow lines into the soil. Children scattered seed, their laughter rising above the caw of crows. Every furrow turned was an act of trust, faith that the earth would return what was given. Meals were simple yet sustaining. Oat bannocks, barley broth, salted fish from the lochs, and cheese from the small family cow. In summer, wild berries and herbs were gathered from the hedgerows. In winter, root vegetables were stored in earthen pits, guarded against frost. Nothing was wasted, for each crumb and drop of milk was the product of unrelenting toil. The village blacksmith worked near the center, his forge a heartbeat of light and heat. With rhythmic precision, he shaped iron into plowshares, horseshoes, and cooking pots, tools that stitched the fabric of rural life together. Nearby, the weaver's cottage hummed with the soft clatter of the loom, as wool from local sheep was transformed into cloth both coarse and fine. Yet life was not merely survival. It was community, woven through kinship, custom, and song. Villagers depended on one another in ways both practical and profound. When illness struck, neighbors shared what they could. When a roof collapsed, many hands rebuilt it. The church, often the sole stone building in the area, stood not only as a place of worship but as the village's gathering heart, hosting feasts, marriages, and markets beneath its modest spire. Each year unfolded like a circle of light and shadow, guided by the agricultural calendar and the Christian feast days that framed it. Candlemas marked the lengthening of days. Beltane celebrated fertility and fire. Lammas honored the first harvest. Evenings often ended with tales told by firelight, legends of saints, of warriors, of creatures that haunted moor and sea. Storytelling was both entertainment and inheritance, keeping the past alive in spoken memory. Music, too, filled the spaces between labor. Fiddles, harps, and pipes accompanied dances in the village square, while soft Gaelic songs carried across the glens at twilight. These melodies, often unrecorded, told of love, loss, and longing. A people's poetry whispered into the wind. Children grew amidst this harmony of hardship and hope. From an early age, they learned the skills that would define their lives. Tending animals, spinning wool, mending nets. Education was rare outside monastic or noble circles, yet wisdom passed through example. To read the sky, to know when the sheep would lamb, to sense when rain would come. This was the knowledge of survival, ancient and unspoken. Faith was ever present, quiet but deep. The sign of the cross before a meal, a whispered prayer before sleep, the lighting of candles for the dead. Such gestures stitched the divine into the fabric of the ordinary. The village priest, though often humble and poor, was a link between earth and heaven, guiding his flock through joy and grief alike. Despite its calm surface, village life was fragile. A single failed harvest could bring famine. A spreading illness could empty cottages overnight. Yet somehow resilience persisted. Even in the hardest winters, when snow buried the paths and the loch froze over, songs still rose from the hearths, songs of gratitude for survival and for the promise of another spring. Occasionally, a merchant or traveling bard passed through, carrying news from distant burgs or tales of noble courts. To the villagers, such stories felt almost unreal, whispers from another world. And yet, in their modest lives, there was a quiet grandeur of their own. A kind of peace that came from knowing one's place within the greater order of creation. By night, as embers dimmed and silence settled, the world beyond the village ceased to matter. The sound of the wind in the thatch, the soft breathing of cattle, and the murmur of prayers mingled into the darkness. Each life, though small in the eyes of history, was complete, lived in tune with the same eternal rhythms that shaped the mountains and the sea. These villages were Scotland's foundation, its living heartbeats. From them came the soldiers, monks, scholars, and kings who would one day shape the realm. But long before names were written in chronicles, it was the nameless who sustained the land, those whose lives, though unrecorded, gave Scotland its soul. But beyond the cottages and cloisters, new forces stirred. Wealth, trade, and power in stone. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the quiet rhythm of rural Scotland began to shift. Where once only fields and monasteries stood, small clusters of timber and stone began to gather around crossroads, river fords, and castle gates. These were the burghs, the young heartbeats of a new urban Scotland. Each burgh began with a charter, granted by the king or a great lord, marking it as a place of commerce and freedom. Within these walls, merchants could trade, craftsmen could organize, and markets could flourish under royal protection. To be a burgher, a free citizen of a burgh, was to live by chartered rights, to belong not to a lord's field, but to the pulse of a growing town. In places like Edinburgh, Perth, and Stirling, streets wound around fortresses and market squares, filled with the clatter of hooves, the cry of vendors, and the scent of baked bread and tanned leather. Timber-framed houses leaned close together, their upper stories almost touching above the narrow lanes. The marketplace was the town's beating heart, where grain and wool, salt fish and hides, were traded for coin, a sound as new as it was transformative. The burghers were a new class, neither noble nor peasant, but something in between. They were builders, traders, and dreamers who measured worth not in lineage, but in skill. Their prosperity depended on trust, reputation, and law. Town councils, known as provosts and bailies, kept order and resolved disputes, while the burgh's seal guaranteed fair trade. It was governance on a smaller, more human scale, and it gave rise to a sense of civic pride previously unknown in Scotland. Each burgh carried its own rhythm. In Aberdeen, the harbour filled with ships from Flanders and the Baltic, carrying wool, salt, and timber. In Perth, river trade along the Tay linked the highlands with the lowlands. Stirling, poised between north and south, became the crossroads of the kingdom, a meeting place for merchants and monarchs alike. The markets were vibrant mosaics of sound. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the gossip of cloth sellers, the song of balladeers weaving stories between stalls. As trade expanded, so did connections beyond Scotland's borders. Merchant guilds forged links with Europe's bustling ports, Bruges, Lubeck, Bergen, exchanging not only goods, but ideas. Through this steady flow came spices from the Mediterranean, fabrics from France, and the influence of new crafts and styles. The sea, once a barrier, became a bridge, turning Scotland outward toward the continent. And yet, for all its commerce and progress, burgh life remained rooted in the familiar. The church towered at the town's center, bells marking the hours just as they did in distant villages. Markets paused for mass, and feast days filled the squares with color and dance. Guilds, bound by oaths and patron saints, blended business with brotherhood. Even prosperity was tempered by piety. Success was celebrated not with excess, but with thanksgiving. Daily life in these towns held both hardship and hope. The cobbled streets were narrow and often unclean, homes were cramped, and fire was a constant danger. Yet the burghs offered opportunity, the promise of freedom for serfs who managed to live within their walls for a year and a day, the chance for young apprentices to learn a craft, for widows to trade in cloth or ale and sustain their households. In this blend of industry and endurance, the towns became mirrors of human adaptability. Over time, burghs began to shape the kingdom itself. The taxes and tolls they generated strengthened royal finances. The merchants' networks enriched Scotland's economy, and their councils introduced new forms of governance that would echo into modern civic life. As the medieval centuries unfolded, the burghs became Scotland's quiet engines of transformation. Places where the pulse of progress beat softly but steadily beneath stone and timber. The skyline of these towns began to change, too. Where once only thatch and timber stood, stone walls and spires rose, marking confidence and permanence. The high street became a symbol of order, a ribbon of commerce and conversation. In the evening light, the glint of lanterns along these streets mirrored the kingdom's own awakening, a glow spreading outward from small centers of human endeavor. For the people who lived within these walls, life moved between the sacred and the practical, the ancient and the new. They were still bound by the cycles of nature, the harvests that supplied their markets, the tides that governed their trade, but they also lived within a framework of laws, charters, and civic identity that hinted at the modern world to come. In the murmur of their markets and the echo of their hammers, Scotland found not only new wealth but new ways of belonging. The land of clans and castles was becoming a land of citizens, where stone by stone, a different kind of strength was being built, quieter, steadier, and destined to endure. As walls rose and trade flowed, so too did ambition, drawing Scotland into new entanglements. Across the rugged contours of medieval Scotland, stone rose against the skyline, towers, battlements, and curtain walls emerging from rock as if drawn up by the land itself. These were not merely strongholds of war. They were the architecture of permanence, testaments to a kingdom learning to define its power in enduring form. The first Scottish castles were born in the Age of Transformation, when Norman influence began to blend with native strength. Early structures of timber and earth, known as motte and bailey castles, dotted the lowlands, perched on raised mounds with wooden palisades encircling them. But as time and conflict reshaped the land, wood gave way to stone, and fortresses began to crown hills and cliffs with unyielding grace. Each castle was a world unto itself, part home, part fortress, part symbol. Stirling Castle, poised upon its volcanic crag, commanded the heart of the kingdom, its position both strategic and poetic. To the north, Urquhart guarded the waters of Loch Ness. To the west, Eilean Donan stood where lochs met the sea, a sentinel of the highlands. And in the shadowed valleys, smaller towers and peel houses echoed the same message, that sovereignty was not only claimed, but built. Within these walls, authority took physical shape. Great halls echoed with the hum of courtly gatherings, messengers arriving with wax-sealed scrolls, nobles dining under banners that told of lineage and loyalty. Yet the grandeur was tempered by purpose. Castles were designed for defense. Their walls were thick enough to absorb the strike of siege engines. Their stairways turned clockwise to favor right-handed defenders. Their arrow slits were narrow, precise, and deliberate. Even beauty here served utility. The castle builders, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, worked with a patience as enduring as their craft. Each stone was cut by hand, lifted into place by timber hoists and sheer resolve. Mortar mixed with lime and sand sealed centuries into permanence. It was slow work but steady, and as the walls grew, so too did the sense that Scotland's identity was being written not only in words or war, but in architecture that could outlast both. Inside, life moved to a rhythm that blended duty with ceremony. The Great Hall was the center, a space where lord and retainer dined together under flickering torchlight, where justice was pronounced and feasts marked the seasons. Above, the private chambers held the quieter world of domestic life. Embroidered cloth, carved oak, the soft light of candles reflected on polished pewter. Below, in the kitchens and storerooms, servants labored endlessly, unseen but essential. Castles also reflected Scotland's divided geography. In the lowlands, their symmetry and refinement mirrored continental influence. French arches, Norman vaulting, and orderly courtyards. In the highlands, the fortresses were rawer, shaped by landscape and necessity. Towers rising directly from rock, as though the mountain itself lent its strength. The language of stone was the same, but its dialects were many. As the centuries passed, castles evolved from stark fortifications into expressions of lineage and taste. Linlithgow Palace, with its ornamental fountains and open courtyards, spoke of a Scotland more secure, turning from defense to dignity. Yet even then, the outer walls remained thick, the gates heavy, reminders that peace in Scotland was always a fragile visitor. To walk the ramparts of these fortresses today is to feel the weight of time itself. The wind hums through broken archways. Ravens circle above keep towers where banners once flew. Each ruin holds within it the memory of 100 voices. Masons at work, soldiers on watch, children laughing in courtyards. These stones, weathered but unbroken, speak across centuries of continuity, of a people who learned that survival is its own kind of grace. The castle, in essence, was a statement that amid change and chaos, something could endure. It was sovereignty made visible, loyalty made solid. Its builders may have dreamed of security, but what they truly built was identity. A legacy that still stands, rooted in the very cliffs and crags that once shielded it. In the mist of morning, when the sun catches the walls of Stirling or the lone tower of Dunatar, the site remains almost sacred. For in these stones lies the memory of a nation, not only its battles and kings, but its belief in endurance, in the quiet defiance of structure against storm. The castles of Scotland were never just fortresses. They were meditations in masonry, where every block carried intention and every tower whispered the same truth. Kingdoms may fall, but stone remembers. But within those walls lived more than rulers. There lived the clans who carried Scotland's spirit. Behind the grey stone walls that crowned Scotland's hills, life unfolded in rhythms both grand and intimate. Though castles loomed as fortresses of power, within them beat the pulse of human routine. Laughter around the hearth, footsteps echoing through narrow corridors, and the steady hum of duty that kept noble households alive. A castle was, first and foremost, a home, though one defined by hierarchy and ceremony. Lords and ladies presided over their estates like small kingdoms, ruling not just through might but through management. Beneath them, stewards tallied harvests, chamberlains kept accounts, and servants attended to every task from dawn until the last taper of candlelight. At sunrise, the castle stirred to life, the courtyards filled with the sound of horses being readied, guards changing post, and fires rekindled in the great hall. The scent of baking bread drifted upward from the kitchens, mingling with the damp chill of morning stone. In these early hours, the household found its rhythm, a delicate balance between labor and loyalty. The great hall was the heart of this world. Beneath timbered ceilings blackened by years of smoke, the Lord's table stretched before a blazing hearth. Here, daily life met ceremony. Meals, gatherings, judgments, and celebrations all unfolded in this single vast chamber. On feast days, the hall glowed with warmth. Tapestries hung to mute the cold, tables laden with roasted meats and ale, minstrels playing songs that told of distant wars or local legends. The air shimmered with the noise of conversation and the clatter of pewter. Yet beyond the revelry, the hall was also a stage of politics and presence. Every guest seated there mattered. Alliances were strengthened with shared wine, disputes settled by a lord's word. Even a simple gesture, an invitation to dine near the dais, could mark favor or fortune. For the ladies of the castle, life held its own sphere of power and purpose. They oversaw the household, managing servants, keeping storerooms full, tending to guests, and ensuring hospitality reflected their family's standing. Many were educated, fluent in Latin prayers and able to read letters sent from distant lands. Their embroidery told stories in thread, of hunts, saints, and seasons, and their patience became its own quiet art. Faith infused every hour. The castle chapel, often small but exquisite, glowed with candlelight and the scent of beeswax. Here, prayers marked the rhythm of day and night, a noble's devotions mingling with the chants of priests. In times of siege or sorrow, these chapels became sanctuaries of stillness, where whispered Latin met the sighing wind beyond the walls. The servants' world, though unseen in the chronicles, was the heartbeat of the castle. Cooks labored before roaring fires, squires polished armor until it gleamed, maids carried water up spiraling stairs, and stable hands tended the horses that were both tools and treasures. For them, the castle was less a fortress and more a living machine, every role a cog in its survival. Amid all this duty, moments of warmth and humanity still flickered. In the kitchens, laughter echoed between the clang of pots. In the chambers, children played near windows cut deep into the stone. Minstrels and storytellers wandered from hall to hall, carrying tales of saints and heroes, weaving words that bound community together. Even in the coldest winters, when snow piled high against the walls, the sound of life never ceased. The murmur of prayer, the crackle of fire, the slow tolling of the chapel bell. But life within the walls was not without its shadows. The air was damp. Rooms were dark save for torchlight. Privacy was scarce, and the draught of the highlands crept through every crevice. To live in a castle was to live surrounded by beauty and burden alike. Grandeur that demanded constant vigilance and endless work. Still, for all its coldness, a castle was a sanctuary in uncertain times. Its walls offered protection not just from war, but from the wild expanse of a harsh world. To those within, the sound of the portcullis descending at night was the sound of safety. And when the day ended, the castle fell into a soft hush. Torches dimmed, and the wind brushed against stone like a familiar voice. Somewhere in the hall, a fire still glowed, the last warmth before dawn. Behind every wall and under every vault, life continued quietly, ordinary, human, and profoundly enduring. Even behind cold walls, warmth lingered, in stories told beside the hearth, in the steady devotion of those who called these fortresses home. As the lords held court, the clans beyond the gates guarded older loyalties. Across the rugged landscape of medieval Scotland, Castles rose not merely as defenses, but as declaration statements in stone that spoke of lineage, power, and belonging. Each wall, each gatehouse, each tower carried more than weight. It carried meaning. The evolution of castle architecture was, in truth, the evolution of a nation discovering its own reflection. The earliest fortifications were simple, motte and bailey castles, born from the Norman influence of the late 11th century. A wooden tower, perched atop an earthen mound, overlooked a fenced courtyard below. These structures, though modest, were revolutionary. They introduced organization and hierarchy into the Scottish landscape. The lord on the height, the community at the base, and beyond them the wild. From such simplicity grew the architectural vocabulary of authority. But wood yielded to stone, as centuries passed and permanence became the new ambition. The transition from timber to granite marked more than material change. It was symbolic. To build in stone was to claim endurance, to carve one's presence into eternity. Castles like Bothwell, Stirling, and Edinburgh began to take form, each blending function with a quiet artistry unique to its time. In the design of these strongholds, one can read the layers of Scotland's identity. The Norman influence brought rounded arches, orderly layouts, and disciplined symmetry, the architecture of control. Yet this formality met the Celtic spirit, where beauty was wilder, asymmetrical, alive with local craft. Gaelic masons shaped stone not as imitation, but as interpretation. The result was a distinctly Scottish style, fortified yet graceful, disciplined yet free. The keeps, often square and unadorned, were not built for comfort but endurance. Their thick walls, narrow stairways, and slit-like windows made them fortresses of patience. The great stone towers, rising from rocky outcrops, seemed to converse with the landscape itself, part of the earth not imposed upon it. Builders adapted to the contours of their surroundings, allowing hills and cliffs to serve as allies. A Scottish castle was never separate from its land. It grew from it. Inside, form met purpose. The great halls expanded, adorned with pointed arches and ribbed vaults, hints of continental Gothic influence arriving through trade and church. Yet ornamentation remained restrained. Unlike the ornate palaces of France or England, Scottish castles favored strength over spectacle. Their beauty lay in restraint, their grace in utility. Each architectural feature told a quiet story. Arrow slits doubled as symbols of vigilance, narrow, precise, unyielding. Gatehouses, reinforced with portcullises and murder holes, were thresholds between peace and peril. Courtyards became the stages of daily life, spaces where soldiers trained, servants labored, and horses were readied for long campaigns. Even the smallest design choice served both meaning and necessity. As building methods advanced, so too did artistry. By the 13th and 14th centuries, masons had mastered the language of fortified elegance. Towers grew rounder for better defense, and curtain walls flowed with the contours of valleys and lochs. The landscape itself became a collaborator in design. Moats fed by rivers, battlements blending with crags. In this harmony between man and land, one senses a distinctly Scottish vision. Power expressed not through domination, but through balance. Some castles, like Eilean Donan, seemed almost like poems written in stone and water. Others, such as Carlaverock, were experiments in geometry, triangular walls meeting at perfect symmetry, a reflection of intellect meeting instinct. The hands that shaped these stones belonged to artisans who likely never saw their names recorded. Yet their legacy endures more vividly than any chronicler's ink. Through centuries, these fortresses evolved beyond warfare. As peace flickered between conflicts, castles became homes of heritage, seats of clans whose identities were tied as tightly to architecture as to ancestry. The MacDonalds of the Isles, the Douglases of the Borders, the Bruces of Annandale, each lineage left its mark, not only in lineage and law, but in lintel and layout. Their strongholds were emblems of who they were: proud, enduring, and bound to the land's raw beauty. To stand before one today, its battlements softened by moss, its walls touched by centuries of rain, is to hear echoes of chisels and prayers intertwined. The language of stone, though silent, remains eloquent. It tells of a people who believed that identity could be built, defended, and remembered. In every arch and arrow slit, a culture carved its name into time. And yet, as stone grew taller, so did pride, and the balance of power began to shift. Before Scotland became a nation of banners and borders, it was a land of names. Old names, carried like seeds through wind and memory. Each name rooted itself in glens, on isles, along rivers and ridges. From those roots the clans were born. More than mere families, they were living communities, woven from kinship, loyalty, and the quiet understanding that survival depended on unity. In the centuries following the early medieval age, as kingdoms stabilized and the great wars ebbed into uneasy peace, the clan system took shape. It was not invented by decree but grew organically from the patterns of the land itself. Highland valleys and island shores were isolated by geography, and so each pocket of habitation developed its own internal structure, a microcosm of governance, sustained by trust and blood ties. A clan was both a family and a nation in miniature. Its people shared a surname, a territory, and a common ancestor, sometimes real, sometimes symbolic. The chief, or seen synod, was not always a distant ruler but often a protector and judge, responsible for his people's safety and honor. Beneath him stood the tacksmen, who managed lands and organized defense, and the clansfolk who worked, herded, and hunted across the hillsides. All were bound by duty and belonging, a shared belief that one's fate was inseparable from the group. The great names still echo through time. MacDonald, the Lords of the Isles, whose power once rivaled kings. Campbell, ever adaptable and strategic. MacLeod, guardians of sky's rugged beauty. Fraser, anchored in the north with their steady strength. Each clan had its Duin, its seat, and its tartan, though patterns and colors varied with availability rather than decree. These details, humble as they might seem, became emblems of identity that would endure for centuries. Clan life was deeply interwoven with the landscape. Rivers marked boundaries, mountains defined loyalties, and lochs reflected stories passed from one generation to the next. In each song and proverb, the natural world mirrored the human one. Steadfast, unpredictable, alive with memory. The glen was not merely home. It was heritage. To leave it was to leave part of oneself behind. Within this world, honor and hospitality were sacred. A stranger arriving at a clan's door was treated first as a guest, not an enemy. Feasting and storytelling bound communities together, reinforcing a shared sense of continuity. The fires that burned in longhouses were not just for warmth but for remembrance. The light by which ancestors were spoken of, their deeds retold in the measured cadence of Gaelic verse. Conflict, of course, was never far away. Disputes over grazing land or inheritance could spark feuds that lasted generations. Yet even amid rivalry, the structure held firm. Clans provided order in a wild landscape, a moral and social framework that made survival possible in times when royal authority reached only faintly into the highlands. The Gaelic language itself was the heart of this identity. Its phrases carried not only poetry but belonging, a rhythm shaped by weather and stone, by the sound of wind through heather. To speak it was to affirm one's place in an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries of hardship and grace. Songs, laments, and blessings were more than art. They were acts of preservation, the oral architecture of a people who valued memory as much as land. Faith, too, played its quiet part. The Christianity that spread through monastic influence merged with older Celtic traditions, creating a spiritual life both grounded and mystical. Saints' days marked the calendar, but so too did harvest festivals and seasonal gatherings. The sacred and the practical were never divided, they shared the same soil. And beneath it all ran the unspoken truth that identity was a collective inheritance. Each child born into a clan carried the name and honor of generations. Each decision, whether to defend a neighbor, to host a guest, or to forgive a rival, was made in awareness of that lineage. It gave meaning to even the smallest act, a sense that life itself was part of a larger, ongoing story. There was beauty in that continuity, a calm assurance that belonging was not something earned, but inherited through the simple act of being. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell, where wars redrew maps and monarchs shifted alliances, the clans remained steady. Their strength lay not in conquest, but in connection, an enduring web of kinship stretching across moor and mountain. Before flags and crowns, there were names, whispered through generations like prayers. But even kinship, sacred as it was, could not always keep peace. In the highlands, honor was as tangible as land. It could not be measured in coin or recorded in parchment, yet it ruled the lives of men and women as surely as the seasons. Every clan carried its reputation like a living inheritance, a legacy of deeds, courage, and memory. To defend that honor was both duty and devotion. In such a world, pride was not arrogance. It was the quiet insistence that one's word, one's blood, and one's ancestors were sacred. Yet the same devotion that bound the clans together often set them against one another. Feuds, sometimes born from simple disputes over grazing rights or borders, could endure for generations. These conflicts, though fierce, were not senseless. They were bound by custom and code, a shared understanding that vengeance and reconciliation were parts of the same cycle. To strike back was expected. To forgive when honor had been restored was equally noble. The great feuds between the Campbells and the MacDonalds, or the Gordons and the Forbes, became part of the folklore of the Highlands. They were remembered not merely for bloodshed, but for the lessons they carried about loyalty and pride. Each side believed itself just, each wound deepened by the weight of ancestry. And yet, time and again, these rivalries would pause, interrupted by marriages, treaties, or the greater threats that required unity. Such alliances were the quiet miracles of clan diplomacy. A daughter married across a divide could bring peace where none had seemed possible. A shared enemy, a rival clan, or even the distant power of the crown, could turn foes into allies overnight. The Highlands, for all their turbulence, were sustained by this rhythm of conflict and compromise. Feuds were storms, alliances the rainbows that followed. At the heart of it all lay the code of honor, an unwritten law more binding than any royal edict. Hospitality was sacred, even among rivals. To harm a guest was a crime beyond forgiveness. Promises, once spoken, carried the weight of an oath to God. And the act of giving one's protection, known as Terg's Comrake, created bonds stronger than fear. In this way, peace could exist even amid perpetual danger, maintained not by peacekeepers but by principle. The weapons of the Highlands, the claymore, the dirk, the targe, were extensions of this code. They were not symbols of aggression but of readiness. A man who bore arms did so not for conquest, but to ensure his people's safety and his honor's defense. Warfare itself often carried a ritual quality. Battles might be preceded by parley, or by gestures meant to preserve dignity on both sides. Even victory was tempered by restraint, the knowledge that one day roles might reverse. Bards and poets preserved these stories with care. Their songs did not glorify endless conflict but sought meaning within it. They sang of the courage of a single warrior who held a bridge, the mercy of a chief who spared an enemy's kin, the wisdom of an elder who ended a blood feud through words instead of steel. These tales shaped moral memory, teaching each new generation that strength and honor were inseparable. And beneath the harshness of clan warfare ran the enduring thread of forgiveness. Many feuds ended not through exhaustion, but through grace. Chiefs would meet upon neutral ground, often on moorland or beside a loch, and exchange tokens of peace. A shared meal, a clasped hand, a promise before witnesses. Such gestures carried the power of centuries. These reconciliations did not erase the past. They transformed it, turning pain into shared endurance. Over time, as Scotland's political landscape evolved, clan alliances began to weave themselves into the broader fabric of national identity. The same families who once clashed with swords would later stand together under banners in defense of their homeland. The instinct for loyalty, fierce, personal, unwavering. became the emotional foundation of a country learning to define itself amid kings, crowns, and shifting borders. In the quiet between battles, truces were sealed not with ink, but with kinship. As clans defined the hills, kings sought once more to define the crown. Across the heathered hills and along the sea-salted shores of medieval Scotland, the Gaelic language carried the pulse of a people. It was more than speech, it was memory made audible. Every phrase seemed shaped by wind and water, by the rhythm of footsteps over moor and stone. In its cadences, one could hear not just communication, but continuity. The steady breath of a culture that had endured through storm, silence, and song. The Gaelic heart of Scotland beat most strongly in the Highlands and Western Isles, where oral tradition was both art and archive. Long before history was written in ink, it was sung. Bards, known as Philid, served as keepers of lineage and lore. They remembered what parchment could not. The rise and fall of chiefs, the stories of heroes, the tragedies of exile, and the quiet triumphs of homecoming. To forget was to dishonor one's people, so they remembered word for word, melody for melody, across generations. Their songs were not loud or boastful, but deeply human. A bard's poem might celebrate a harvest, lament a fallen kinsman, or praise the courage of a chief. Others wove nature into narrative, rivers and mountains becoming symbols of loyalty or endurance. Through such art, the Gaelic imagination transformed the landscape into living myth. Every glen had a story, every island a song. Music carried this same inheritance. The harp, delicate yet resonant, was the instrument of memory. The strings told what words could not. In the evenings, as fires crackled in longhouses and the air grew still, melodies drifted like prayer. Each note recalled ancestors, losses, victories, and hopes. In these gatherings, community found both solace and strength. The music was not performance, it was remembrance. Storytelling, too, held sacred importance. Around hearths and in halls, tales passed from elder to youth. Stories of warriors, saints, and spirits that blurred the boundaries between history and legend. These narratives carried moral lessons, yes, but they also carried belonging. When a child heard the exploits of Finn MacCool or the journey of St. Columba, they were not simply learning tales. They were learning who they were. In the Gaelic worldview, language itself was an act of faith, a way of preserving the divine in the everyday. Blessings greeted sunrise and harvest alike, each moment sanctified through speech. Even common sayings, passed in quiet conversation, held poetry within them. To speak Gaelic was to see the world through a softer lens, where place, ancestry, and emotion were inseparable. This oral tradition also served as Scotland's unwritten history. When wars erased documents and castles fell to ruin, the songs survived. When rulers changed tongues or faiths, the bards continued their recitations, safeguarding stories that might otherwise have vanished. Through them, the continuity of Scotland's spirit remained unbroken. The Gaelic sense of time was circular rather than linear. The past was never gone. It lived alongside the present, folded into the everyday. Each song sung and each story retold reopened the bridge between generations. It is perhaps this worldview that gave the Highlands their deep resilience. A refusal to see change as ending, but rather as another verse in an eternal song. And though the centuries brought upheaval, new laws, languages, and rulers, the Gaelic heart endured. Even when silenced by authority or dismissed as rustic, it continued to beat quietly beneath the surface of Scottish identity. It endured in lullabies sung to children, in laments whispered to the dead, in prayers muttered in lonely glens. It endured because it was never just culture. It was connection. To this day, echoes of that heritage remain. In the lilt of a tune, in the roll of certain words, in the landscape itself, the Gaelic heart still speaks. It reminds us that a people's truest strength lies not in walls or crowns, but in the stories they choose to remember. In every tune of the harp and every word of Gaelic verse, memory itself took breath. But the outside world was changing, and soon change would reach even the quiet glens. The story of Scotland's monarchy reached a turning point with the rise of the Stuart dynasty, a lineage woven from ambition, faith, and fragile peace. Emerging from the embers of medieval turbulence, the Stuarts promised stability. Yet, as their power grew, so too did the subtle tensions between crown and people, between Scotland's independence and its destiny entwined with England's. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Stuarts consolidated their rule. Kings like James I and James IV sought to balance royal authority with the autonomy of noble clans, weaving diplomacy where violence once ruled. Under James IV, Scotland thrived, its court a beacon of Renaissance learning, music, and chivalry. His marriage to Margaret Tudor, daughter of England's Henry VII, was intended as a bond of peace. But in that union of bloodlines lay the seed of a far greater, more complicated union to come. The early 16th century was an age of shifting power. Across Europe, reformations stirred, kingdoms expanded, and monarchs sought divine right to justify earthly rule. Scotland, though proud and independent, could not remain untouched. When James IV fell at Flodden in 1513, leaving behind his infant son, James V, the nation entered another fragile age. The court became a stage for foreign influence. France, the Church, and England all vying for favor and faith. The next generation deepened this divide. Mary, Queen of Scots, inherited not only the crown but the turmoil of her age. Her life, at once regal and tragic, symbolized the struggle between personal conviction and political survival. A Catholic queen in a Protestant-leaning realm, she became both a rallying figure and a threat. Her abdication and eventual execution in 1587 under Elizabeth I marked the end of an era, yet also set the course for Scotland's most fateful inheritance. When Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, the English crown sought its nearest heir, James VI of Scotland, Mary's son. And thus, for the first time, one monarch ruled both kingdoms, becoming James VI and I. His journey south from Edinburgh to London marked a historic transformation, the union of the crowns. Though Scotland and England remained separate nations, their destinies were now bound by one sovereign mind. It was a union of paradox. To some, it promised peace after centuries of war. To others, it threatened the erosion of Scotland's hard-won identity. James, ever the intellectual and theologian, dreamed of a unified Britain, one people under one king, yet his vision met resistance. The Scottish Parliament guarded its independence fiercely, its people, their faith, and customs. The two nations shared a ruler but not a heart. For Scotland, this was a time of both opportunity and unease. Trade expanded, new ideas flowed more freely across the border, and Scots found influence within a larger stage. But alongside these gains came quiet losses, the subtle dilution of sovereignty, the shift of power toward London, the fading of Edinburgh's political centrality. The king himself now resided in England, and Scotland felt, for the first time, the distance of its own monarch. In the streets and kirks, people wondered what this new unity meant. Was it the beginning of lasting peace, or the first shadow of absorption? The answer, then as now, depended on where one stood. To nobles seeking royal favor, the union offered prestige and patronage. To farmers, merchants, and ministers, it was a change felt more in rumor than reality. A distant decision written in ink, not in soil. And yet, beyond politics, something quieter was taking shape, a shared cultural rhythm. Scottish poets wrote of both nations. Merchants crossed the border with goods and stories. Even faith began to intertwine, though not without friction. The crowns were joined, but the hearts remained divided. A fragile equilibrium that would define the next century. In this moment, history seemed to pause, suspended between past and future, between pride and pragmatism. Scotland, though still its own kingdom, was learning to live within a dual identity. Sovereign in name, yet connected by crown. When one crown came to rest upon two heads, history held its breath. With peace on parchment, the question remained, could unity ever replace identity? By the mid-16th century, Scotland stood on the edge of profound spiritual transformation. What began as murmurs of discontent against corruption in the medieval church soon swelled into a revolution of conscience, the Scottish Reformation. It was not merely a change of doctrine, but a reorientation of the soul, turning devotion inward and redefining what it meant to believe. The grandeur of the old faith, the incense, the Latin chants, the gilded relics, began to wane under the stern light of reform. Across the land, monasteries that had once pulsed with psalm and silence grew still. At Melrose, Arbroath, and Iona, centuries of tradition faded, their cloisters echoing only with the wind. The statues were taken down, altars stripped, and the ornate beauty of the old church replaced with a stark simplicity that mirrored the new faith's inward focus. The driving force behind this transformation was John Knox, a fiery preacher whose conviction matched the storm of his times. Trained in Geneva under John Calvin, Knox returned to Scotland with a vision, a nation reformed by scripture, discipline, and direct communion with God. His words thundered through the kirks, igniting not just rebellion against Rome, but a call for moral clarity and national identity. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament adopted the Reformation, officially severing ties with the papacy. The Kirk of Scotland was born, Presbyterian in form, democratic in spirit, and deeply intertwined with the people's daily life. The pulpit replaced the altar, sermons replaced ceremony. For many, it was liberation, a faith free from hierarchy, grounded in personal study and community prayer. Yet for others it was loss, a rupture in the ancient rhythm of worship, a silence where once the choir had sung. But beneath the public upheaval, something quieter endured. The soul of faith, humble, human, and enduring, found new expression. In cottages and farmsteads, families gathered to read scripture by candlelight. Ministers traveled from parish to parish, bringing not grandeur, but guidance. The words of the Bible, once distant in Latin, now spoke in the familiar cadence of Scots, making heaven itself feel nearer. The Reformation also reshaped education. Literacy became sacred, for to read the Word was to know God directly. Schools were founded across the land, and the people, once reliant on priests, became stewards of their own belief. It was a spiritual democratization that strengthened the nation's intellect as much as its conscience. Still, the new faith brought new conflicts. Scotland's allegiance was divided, not just between old and new religions, but between royal authority and the Kirk's independence. Kings and queens struggled to command a faith that recognized only one true sovereign, God. The tension between pulpit and crown, between conscience and control, would echo through generations, shaping Scotland's political destiny as surely as its spiritual one. Yet amid all change, continuity quietly persisted. The landscape itself, the hills, the rivers, the sacred sites, remained sanctified in the hearts of the people. Pilgrimages may have ceased, but reverence for the land endured. The sense of the divine in nature, so deeply rooted in Celtic Christianity, survived the storms of reform. The people of Scotland did not lose faith, they reimagined it. By the dawn of the 17th century, the nation had transformed. The great cathedrals no longer ruled faith. Instead, the simple kirk became the spiritual hearth of every village. Bells still rang, prayers still rose, but they spoke now of a faith both humble and unbreakable. A belief born not in marble halls, but in the steady rhythm of life. As cathedrals emptied, the heart of faith moved inward, from stone to soul. And as faith evolved, so too did the very rhythm of life. In the far reaches of Scotland, beyond the lowland fields and merchant towns, the highlands endured vast, untamed, and slow to bend to the march of time. Here, tradition was not a relic but a living presence. The old Gaelic tongue still carried across glens and lochs. Kinship still bound families to their land. Yet, by the 17th and 18th centuries, the winds of change began to whisper through the heather. The world beyond the mountains was shifting, and even the highlands could not remain untouched. The Union of the Crowns in 1603, and later the Union of Parliaments in 1707, brought new ties to England and a growing sense of a British identity. To the Highlander, however, these changes felt distant. political words written far from the peat fires and misty bens. Life here still moved by the ancient rhythm of clan and croft. The chief remained protector, the land sacred, the songs unchanged. But the slow encroachment of centralized power, of taxes, trade, and armies, began to test the endurance of that old world. The Highlands were more than geography. They were an idea, a way of being that cherished loyalty, memory, and place. Yet as lowland Scotland grew more urban and outward-looking, the north came to be seen as remote, even backward. English and lowland influence brought roads, forts, and administration into the glens. After the Jacobite risings, when Highland clans rallied for the old Stuart cause, the government sought to tame what it could not understand. The Jacobite defeat at Culloden in 1746 marked not just the end of a rebellion, but the beginning of a transformation. The sword was replaced by law. The tartan and bagpipe, once symbols of pride, were forbidden. The clan chiefs, stripped of their martial authority, turned from guardians of kin to landlords of property. The people, once bound to their chiefs through loyalty and love, became tenants in a new, colder system. Still, the spirit of the Highlands did not fade easily. In the quiet of the hills, old songs continued, laments of loss and longing, of heroes and home. The Gaelic bards kept memory alive when power could not. Their verses spoke of vanished glories and steadfast hearts, reminding all who listened that though kingdoms might fall, culture endured. As the 18th century turned to the 19th, change deepened. The Highland clearances began, a slow and sorrowful scattering of communities that had endured for centuries. Families who had farmed their land for generations were evicted to make way for sheep. The glens that once echoed with children's laughter and the call of cattle grew silent. Many sailed westward, across the Atlantic, carrying their grief and their language to new lands. Yet, even in exile, the Highland heart remained unbroken. Songs once sung beneath Scottish skies found new life in the diaspora, in Nova Scotia, in Canada, in the far reaches of the world. Wherever a Highlander stood, he carried with him a piece of home, a word, a melody, a memory. The transformation of the Highlands was more than economic or political, it was emotional. It marked the passing of an age, the quiet erosion of a communal world rooted in kinship and tradition. But even as progress claimed its toll, something timeless endured. The mountains, unchanged by empire or industry, stood as they always had, silent witnesses to both glory and grief. And in the wind that swept across the moors, one could still hear it, the faint echo of a bagpipe, the murmur of an ancient tongue, the breath of a people who refused to be forgotten. In the wind over the moors, the old songs lingered, even as the world below changed. But from change would come loss and a fading way of life. The winter winds of 1745 carried more than cold through the Highland glens. They carried the sound of drums, of pipes, of distant hope. Across Scotland, whispers spread of a prince returned, a Stuart come home to claim what his ancestors had lost. Charles Edward Stuart, remembered as Bonnie Prince Charlie, had landed on the western shores with a handful of loyal men, bearing the promise of restoration, not merely of a dynasty, but of a way of life. To the Highland clans, weary of neglect and heavy taxes, his arrival stirred the embers of a fading dream. For decades, the Highlands had lived under suspicion and constraint, their culture viewed as defiant, their loyalties questioned. But now, beneath the prince's banner, unity flickered anew. Clan by clan, oath by oath, men took up arms, not for conquest, but for memory, for identity, for the ghost of a freer Scotland. The 45 Rising, as it came to be known, unfolded with a sense of inevitability and tragedy. Against all odds, the Jacobite forces swept south, capturing Edinburgh and defeating the government army at Prestonpans. For a brief and shining moment, it seemed as though fortune had turned. The prince entered Edinburgh in triumph, his youth and charm rekindling a nation's pride. Yet beneath the celebration lay uncertainty, for not all of Scotland rose with him, and England remained unmoved. As the army marched south toward London, the dream began to falter. Supplies dwindled, support waned. In Derby, the advance halted, not for lack of courage, but of conviction. The Highlanders, far from home and surrounded by an unfamiliar land, began to retreat northward. The prince's vision, bright as it had burned, now dimmed in the face of reality. The end came on a cold April morning in 1746, on the bleak moor of Culloden. There, near Inverness, the Jacobite army met the forces of the British crown. The field was sodden with rain and heavy with dread. The Highland charge, fierce, loyal, unstoppable in legend, met disciplined lines of musket and cannon. Within less than an hour, the rebellion was broken. The Battle of Culloden was not merely a defeat. It was an ending. As smoke cleared and cries faded, so too did an age of clan power and Highland independence. The reprisals that followed were swift and merciless. The government sought not only to punish rebellion but to erase the conditions that had birthed it. Weapons were banned, tartans outlawed, and the Gaelic language suppressed. Chiefs were stripped of authority, their lands confiscated or sold. The Highlands, once a patchwork of proud kinship, were left fractured and subdued. And yet, even in defeat, there was dignity. Stories of bravery endured, of clansmen who refused to flee, of women who hid fugitives in their homes, of the prince's escape through heather and storm, aided by loyalty unbroken. The legend of Flora MacDonald, who risked all to ferry him over the sea to Skye, became a symbol of quiet courage. Though the Jacobite cause had failed, its spirit survived in the songs that followed, in the laments sung by firesides and the ballads carried to distant shores. In the years after Culloden, the Highlands grew silent. The glens that once echoed with the march of warriors now heard only the wind and the cry of distant eagles. But memory lingered, not as rebellion, but as reverence. The Jacobite dream became a story of loss and longing, a reminder that even noble causes can fade when faced with the tide of history. Still, to this day, when the pipes play softly across the misted fields of Culloden, it is not just a battle that is remembered, but a people, their courage, and their yearning for something greater than themselves. In the frost of the Highlands, hope marched one last time beneath tattered banners. When the pipes fell silent at Culloden, so too did an age. In the quiet years after Culloden, the Highlands entered a new kind of struggle, not of battle but of survival. The clan system that had bound people to land and lineage was dismantled, its roots torn by the forces of modernity and economics. Chiefs, once guardians of their kin, had become landlords seeking profit. The old bonds of duty and protection weakened beneath the weight of a changing world. By the late 18th century, the transformation was relentless. Across Sutherland, Rossshire, and the Isles, families were evicted from ancestral homes. Thatched cottages that had stood for generations were dismantled or burned, their smoke drifting into the cold air like the last breath of an era. The land that had once nurtured human life was now given over to sheep farming, seen as more efficient, more profitable, more modern. The people, crofters, herders, weavers, had no place in this new vision. Some were forced to the coast, to make meager livings from fishing or kelp harvesting. Others, with hearts heavy and hopes dim, chose exile. They gathered what little they could, a few tools, a family Bible, a handful of soil, and boarded ships bound for Canada, America, Australia, and New Zealand. To them, the sea was both salvation and sorrow, carrying them toward new beginnings while leaving everything familiar behind. It is said that when the last families left their glens, the hills echoed with the sound of the pipes, a lament for a vanished home. In those moments, history became heartbreak and progress felt like loss. The Highland clearances were not a single event, but a series of quiet tragedies stretched over decades. Each eviction was personal, each departure a thread pulled from the fabric of a culture. For those who remained, life changed beyond recognition. The Gaelic tongue faded from daily use, songs and stories, once shared in the warmth of community, became whispers of remembrance. Yet, even as the glens grew emptier, the spirit of the Highlands endured. Across the seas, in distant lands, the exiled Scots built new lives, carving farms from wilderness, founding towns, and carrying with them the customs and music of home. Their descendants, generations later, would still speak of Scotland not as a place lost, but as a presence within the soul. The clearances reshaped more than a landscape. They reshaped the Scottish identity itself. Out of loss came resilience, a quiet strength that would define the Scottish character in the centuries to come. The idea of home became not a piece of land, but a memory shared across oceans, bound by story, song, and longing. And even now, when one walks through the empty straths and valleys, the traces remain. Stone foundations buried in grass, a lone tree where a cottage once stood, a faint echo of laughter carried on the wind. The highlands remember, and through them so do we. As cottages emptied, the echoes of home sailed with every departing ship. Yet even in exile, memory endured, soft, unbroken, eternal. By the close of the 18th century, the world that had defined Scotland for nearly 1,000 years was fading into memory. The Highlands, once alive with the pulse of clans and kinship, stood quiet. The castles still stood, proud yet lonely, their stones bearing the marks of centuries, their halls now echoing with absence. What had once been a living network of loyalties and lands became a chapter in history, sealed by time. The feudal bonds that had once ordered life, between lord and tenant, chief and clansman, dissolved under the weight of modernization. The Enlightenment brought new ideas of economy, reason, and progress. The lowlands became a place of industry and learning, while the highlands were increasingly seen as a landscape of nostalgia. Beautiful, remote, and tragic. The people who had once been the heart of these lands were now scattered, their traditions carried in fragments of memory and verse. Yet even as the medieval fabric unraveled, Scotland's soul found new forms of expression. Poets like Robert Burns and James Macpherson, through his Ossian epics, rekindled the romance of the Highlands. Their words turned sorrow into song, giving voice to what had been lost. The ruins of abbeys and castles became symbols, reminders of endurance, of a culture too deeply woven into the land to vanish entirely. Travelers and painters, too, began to look upon the Highlands with wonder. The misted glens and craggy peaks that had once been battlegrounds were now seen as landscapes of beauty and reflection. Artists like Horatio McCulloch and writers like Sir Walter Scott transformed Scotland's past into myth, painting it in hues of melancholy and pride. Through their eyes, the vanished world was reborn, not as a political reality, but as a poetic truth. But beneath this romantic revival lay the real, enduring strength of the Scottish people. In towns and cities, in faraway colonies and new nations, Scots built, taught, and led. The legacy of learning, from monasteries to universities, endured, as did the quiet perseverance that had always defined the nation. The same resilience that had once held the Highlands together now carried its people into a new age. The transformation was profound, yet never complete. Walk through the glens at dusk, and the past feels near. The air itself seems to remember, the faint murmur of Gaelic, the distant echo of hooves, the warmth of hearths long gone. In ruined chapels and moss-covered stones, history lingers, not as a ghost, but as presence. This was the twilight of medieval Scotland. Not a collapse, but a soft surrender to time. The old ways yielded, yet their essence endured in art, in language, in the unspoken bond between people and place. The castles still stood, silent sentinels of a world slipping into legend. And though that world had vanished, its light was not extinguished. It simply changed form, from deed to memory, from power to poetry. And so, from the silence of history, we turn to what remains, the legacy that still whispers. Across Scotland's rugged landscape, ruins rise like memories made visible, silent, steadfast, and unyielding to time. The crumbled battlements of Dunatar, the weathered arches of Melrose Abbey, the lonely towers standing sentinel over misted lochs. Each is a heartbeat of the past, faint but eternal. These stones do not merely endure. They speak, carrying whispers of faith, conflict, and love across centuries. Time has softened their edges, but not their meaning. A castle wall may stand half-fallen, yet its presence commands reverence. The moss that clings to it is not decay, but continuation. Nature's quiet hand preserving what man has left behind. To walk among these ruins is to step into a living memory, where history is not confined to books, but woven into the earth beneath one's feet. Each stone tells its own story. Some once bore the weight of banners fluttering in victory. Others sheltered monks whose chants rose into cold dawns. Abbeys, once filled with devotion, now lie open to the sky, their arches framing clouds where once stood saints. In their emptiness, they gain a strange fullness, a space where silence speaks louder than prayer. These ruins are more than remains of power or piety. They are reminders of continuity, of how time transforms but never erases. The same winds that once carried the cries of battle now rustle through grass and heather. The same sunlight that gilded crowns now falls softly across broken stone. The rhythm of the land endures, echoing the persistence of the people who shaped it. Visitors come from every corner of the world to stand in these places, drawn not only by beauty but by resonance. There is comfort in knowing that something built so long ago still stands, however fragilely. It tells us that even in the face of loss, creation matters, that effort, artistry, and faith leave traces time cannot wholly reclaim. For Scots themselves, these ruins are anchors, physical ties to identity. They remind a modern nation, vibrant and forward-looking, that its strength was forged through centuries of endurance. The castles that once guarded borders now guard memory. The abbeys that once housed prayer now house reflection. In their stillness, these places teach a quiet truth, that the past is not gone. It simply changes its voice. The clang of sword and the ring of bell have faded, yet in their place remains a hum, the low, eternal murmur of legacy. To stand before such stones is to feel both small and infinite. Each step between ruined walls bridges centuries, a communion between those who built, those who fell, and those who remember. It is not nostalgia that lingers here, but gratitude, a reverence for all that endures, even when the world moves on. Every stone holds a heartbeat, faint but eternal. From stone to story, the past continues to breathe. In every gathering of kin, the Highlands live again. Though the centuries have scattered Scotland's children to distant shores, the pulse of the clans still beats steady and sure. From the glens and lochs of the homeland to bustling cities across oceans, the spirit of kinship, loyalty, pride, and shared memory endures like a flame sheltered from the wind. The clans were never merely names or banners. They were living families rooted in land and lineage, defined by a code of honor and belonging. That sense of identity, born in the misted highlands and heathered valleys, could not be silenced by time, war, or distance. Today, it thrives in new forms. In tartan patterns worn with quiet reverence, in the gathering of clan societies, and in songs sung not from memory, but from inheritance. At Highland Games in North America, Australia, and beyond, pipes and drums summon echoes of the past. Children learn the dances their ancestors once performed beside roaring fires. Clan chiefs, once rulers of rugged territories, now serve as custodians of tradition, keeping alive the symbols of unity that define their people. Across continents, the Scottish diaspora has turned remembrance into celebration, transforming history's hardships into heritage. Every name carries a story. The Campbells, the Frasers, the MacDonalds, the MacLeods, once divided by feuds and geography, now stand side by side beneath their shared history. Each tartan, a woven language of identity, tells of struggle and survival. To wear it is to say, I remember. It is not mere pride, but continuity, an affirmation that the past lives on in the present. Even in Scotland itself, where modernization has reshaped towns and cities, the old loyalties linger. In the Highlands, small communities still bear traces of the ancient clan territories. Songs in Gaelic, once nearly lost, are now sung again by new generations. Storytelling, that ancient inheritance, continues around tables, in schools, and through modern voices determined that the chain of memory not be broken. The endurance of the clans is not about resistance to change, but the ability to evolve without losing essence. Their power now lies not in arms or land, but in unity, in the collective remembrance of shared beginnings. Whether one stands at Culloden's quiet field or far across the seas in Nova Scotia, there is a sense that all belong to a story greater than any one life. This endurance is a kind of peace. Where once loyalty demanded battle, it now calls for remembrance. The feuds are gone, but the bonds remain, softened by time, deepened by gratitude. What began as survival has become celebration, proof that culture, when carried in the heart, cannot vanish. In every gathering of kin, the Highlands live again, not in defiance of time, but in harmony with it. The old songs are now sung for joy, not sorrow. The tartans dance in sunlight, not war. What endures is not the struggle, but the spirit, unbroken, unforgotten, alive. The clans were born from the land, and like the land, they remain reshaped by centuries, but eternal in essence. To remember them is to remember ourselves, not as isolated souls, but as threads in a vast tapestry, woven across time and distance. And so, through stories, gatherings, and names spoken with love, the spirit of the clans endures, quiet, proud, and everlasting. As heritage persists, so too does inspiration. The past does not sleep. It dreams, gently, within us all. Modern Scotland stands as both ancient and alive, a nation where stone and sky still hold memory. In the hum of city streets and the hush of the glens, traces of the medieval spirit linger, woven into the rhythm of modern life. Its castles may be ruins, its monarchs long gone, yet their echoes shape imagination still. To walk through Edinburgh's old winds or along the walls of Stirling is to step across centuries in a single breath. The scent of rain on mossed stone, the outline of battlements against gray skies, all whisper of a past that refuses to fade. Artists, writers, and dreamers continue to find in Scotland's landscapes not just scenery, but story. Painters capture the solemn beauty of ruined abbeys. Poets give voice to the ghosts of kings and rebels. Filmmakers and musicians return again and again to the Highlands, drawn by the timeless blend of melancholy and majesty. In literature, too, the medieval heart beats strong. From Walter Scott's romantic tales to modern retellings that reimagine clans and queens, the legends of Scotland remain fertile ground for creativity. The myths of Selkies and Standing Stones, of heroes like Wallace and Bruce, endure not because they are facts, but because they are truths, emotional, human, and eternal. Every generation rediscovers them, reshaping them to fit its own questions of courage, belonging, and freedom. Music carries that same inheritance. The drone of bagpipes at a festival, the soft strum of a Celtic harp, or the plaintive lilt of a Gaelic song, all serve as reminders that Scotland's voice never truly went silent. Even in new forms, like folk fusion and cinematic soundtracks, the pulse of the old melodies remains. Modern musicians channel the same longing and pride that once echoed through glens under starlit skies. And in language, in Gaelic, Scots, and English alike, the old cadences persist. Words carry memory. They shape how a people understand themselves. The revival of Gaelic learning and song is not only preservation but continuation, a living dialogue between past and present. Through speech and storytelling, Scotland speaks itself anew, every day. Tourism, too, is an act of communion with memory. Visitors from across the world come seeking more than sights. They seek connection. Standing before the misted peaks of Glencoe or the shores of Loch Ness, they feel what cannot be written, the hush that tells them they are standing on sacred ground. To many, Scotland represents something timeless: endurance, mystery, and grace in the face of history's storms. Yet modern Scotland is no museum. It is a nation of artists, engineers, thinkers, and dreamers, proud of its past but alive in its future. Its medieval roots offer not nostalgia but grounding, a reminder that endurance comes not from holding still, but from carrying the past forward with gentleness. The same quiet resilience that built abbeys, defended borders, and sang in Gaelic verse now thrives in universities, studios, and homes. In an age of speed and noise, Scotland's story invites stillness. This history does not clamor for attention, it whispers. It reminds us that progress and peace need not be opposites, that strength can be silent, and that time's passage need not mean loss. The medieval soul of Scotland lives on in how its people remember, create, and care for the land that gave them voice. To reflect on Scotland is to reflect on continuity, how memory becomes art, how art becomes identity, and how identity becomes legacy. The medieval world, with its faith, labor, and longing, still hums beneath the surface of the modern one. It is not gone, it has simply changed its form. The castles are museums, the monasteries are ruins, but the spirit that built them, the yearning for belonging and beauty, remains eternal. The past does not sleep. It dreams, in every melody, every misted glen, every quiet act of remembrance. Scotland, more than most places, teaches us that history is not something left behind, but something we live with. It moves through us, like the wind that shapes the heather. And so, as we listen to that wind, to its low, patient song, we hear the story still unfolding. The same story sung by monks and warriors, poets and wanderers. The story of a people who endured, adapted, and remembered. And as the night settles over the Highlands once more, the story of Scotland continues. Calm, eternal, and awake in memory.